fantastic to have you here today. I'm really excited for this session that we're doing this afternoon. I've been joined by an amazing guest who I will introduce shortly to you. One of the things that I wanted to think about today is leaders in the church and the experiences they have and the impact that leaders can have on members of the church and their own lived experiences. And I want to be clear, all right? I think that the leaders in the church, on the whole, are really, really good people. You don't seek the office of bishop, you don't seek the office of stake president. If you happen to have unfortunately been called for a meeting with the stake presidency one Saturday afternoon and asked to bring your wife with you, I thankfully avoided this, but if you've had that call, you'll understand, because you know that you've got a minimum of 5 to 6 years of hard work coming your way. Our bishops work and serve really, really hard. They receive somewhere between little and no formal training on how to do their job, and they effectively have to put in the equivalent of a full-time work on top of their day jobs because they're not paid. A bishop is working a full-time job and is working a full-time job as a bishop as well, untrained, trying to support a congregation and members of a ward who have their own challenges and problems and difficulties. And the same can be said for a stake president as well. The difference is you're going to get someone by an area authority or a general authority, and if you get that call, you're in it for 10, not 5. Our bishops very often serve with young children. It's quite normal for a bishop to have children in primary, to have babes in arms, to have a wife who is looking after young children while the husband is absent from the home. And that's just a reality of the calling. I'm not trying to be critical. I'm not trying to be negative about that. It's just a reality of the calling. So we have hardworking, honest, sincere people doing the best that they can with minimal training. It's no accident that within other faith traditions, to be able to take a leadership position normally involves a number of years of studying on how to do the job. Today's guest is going to talk about some of her experiences as she grew up in the church, as she made mistakes, didn't make mistakes. Her family had challenges and crises and problems, as we all do, and how those leaders who, with the best will in the world, maybe didn't respond to the challenges in my guest's life the way that they could have done. And we're going to hear and we're going to look at some of the impacts that has on members of the church. Quick trigger warning, today's interview is going to cover some hard subjects. We are going to talk about people being let down and people being hurt, but we are going to touch very briefly, at least, on concepts of abuse. And I want to make that clear before we start, so that if you are watching and that is a trigger for yourself, you can practice good self-care. You can either prepare yourself beforehand, or if it's too triggering, please turn off and come and join us on some of the other streams that we do. This is we want to uplift, we want to help and support. We do not want to cause harm or cause challenges to people. So, having said that, like I said, today is all about how we explore a faith journey, how our leaders perhaps are not equipped to do the things that they should be able to do, based around the training they receive, not as a criticism of the people that they are. I'd like to introduce my guest today, Sarah Turnbull. Sarah Turnbull was a member of the church for many years, and actually I can talk about Sarah all I like. I'd much rather let her introduce herself.
Hi.
So what I'd like to do before we get going and have a chat, really, can I just get you to introduce yourself? Give us a little background, a bit of background who you are and why when we had that conversation and you decided you want to come and record this session, what was the motivation behind that today? Why are we here anyway?
Okay, so so I want to make it really clear first of all that I'm not here to try and tear down anyone's faith. That's not what this is about. And I recognise that there are many people who have had really wonderful, positive experiences growing up in the church, and it's been a real source of joy for them. Unfortunately, my upbringing in the church was very traumatic for a variety of different reasons, um, predominantly related to leaders and the way that I was treated in certain situations, which we'll obviously get onto. Um, and I found a lot of healing in my journey through listening to the stories of others. Knowing that my story it is unique, but it's also not unique. There's a lot of other stories out there that are really similar to mine. Um, and so I'm hoping that maybe my story might help others the way that other people's stories have helped me. I'm also kind of hoping that there might be some active members here that might be able to learn something from this, learn about how the church can cause trauma, and so that they can try and be part of the solution and not the problem, and make sure that they're not making the same mistakes that other people made with me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. I really, really appreciate that. I think is really important is that one of the key messages we want to get across today, I think, is that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, whether it intends to or not, the things that we do can cause pain, suffering, and trauma to people. And that's partly based around some of the policies the church has that marginalize certain communities, and partly based around good people without good training. I think is probably where it
Well,
comes down to. And I think that your experience probably touched on both of those areas slightly. It would be fair to say. Um, but let's go back to the beginning. When you and I spoke before, when we were talking about this, you talked to me about your family and how you grew up in the church and the experiences you had. And if my memory serves me right, you were in a small unit at the time, weren't you?
yeah, so I grew up in a branch. We became a ward when I was, I think, about 13. I was in youth, but hadn't been in it for very long.
Okay. Um, Talk to me a little bit about those early experiences in that branch. Now, was it a good place to be? Did you enjoy that? How was your family with that? And how did you experience being in a small branch in the southwest of England?
Um, yes, I would say certainly the first 10 years or so of my life, I absolutely loved being a Mormon. I loved church. I really, believed it wholeheartedly. Loved the community, loved the people. Um, and I've got really fond memories, of primary activities. And yeah, we were a small unit, so our primary wasn't very big. Um, but then I think in some ways it meant that us children were quite close because there wasn't that many of us, so we all kind of stuck together. Um, and yeah, I was quite lucky in that the unit was already starting to grow by the time I can really remember. So, and
Yeah.
there were a lot of kids my sort of age. So by the time I got up into youth, we had quite a good amount of young men and young women. Whereas years prior, like when my older brothers were in youth, there was maybe like 4 or 5 young men and women total. Whereas we probably had, I don't know, 7 or 8 young men and 6 or 7 young women. So
It makes a big
yeah,
difference, doesn't it? Having a good youth group makes a big difference. I remember for myself, my youth group when I was first turned 12 was myself, my brother, and one other girl within the ward who
oh
family was
wow,
semi-active. Well, semi-active. We were in a tiny branch with about 25 members
wow.
along those ways, and then we moved into a unit which had more. But I'm not. But it's interesting how having a good youth group makes a difference in there. What was your favourite primary song?
Oh, I've forgotten what it's called. I'm actually quite glad I've forgotten what it's called because so many of this stuff was burned into my memory for so many years. But it's the one that Heavenly Father. Is it a child's prayer?
Are you really there?
Is that
Do
right?
you hear and
Yeah.
answer every child's prayer? Some say that heaven is far away. It's a good primary song. And why? Why was that your favourite?
Um, I think as a young child, my relationship with, I mean, I'll be honest now that I don't believe in God, or at least I don't know if I believe in God. Um, but obviously I really did back then, and my relationship with my Heavenly Father was really important to me. And I think it really meant something to me because the whole song is basically just talking about the fact that Heavenly Father loves you and that He's going to listen to you, that He's going to be there for you.
Yeah. So
And that was really,
was prayer an important part of your life in those early years then? Because that song was all about prayer.
oh, yeah, definitely. I prayed all the time, to the end of God, all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and my family were, I would say, quite strict with the Mormon rules. We did all the
Okay.
things. So we had family prayer twice a day. We read our scriptures together every day. So that was just all a big part of my upbringing. Yeah.
Yeah. Family home evening.
Oh yeah, family home evening, father's interviews, family councils. Like we did all of it, all the things.
Yeah. And did that? I'm assuming that felt fairly normal for you as a child then, that you just accepted that and enjoyed that, and that was part of your life.
Yeah, it was. I didn't know any different.
Okay. So here's my question then, and I'm just thinking about our conversation before. You grew up in a small branch. Did you stay in that small branch throughout your time in the church?
Pretty much, yeah.
Was there a
Bar
time?
bar a period where we were attending another ward for I think about 9 or 10 months. But outside of that, my whole church life was in the same unit.
Okay, so you attended a different walk. It's unusual. One of the things that is very structural about the church, and is one of the things that actually peripherally I think can cause difficulties at times, is the idea is that you are allocated a ward based around your geographic location, and you're obliged to attend that ward, and you really don't have a say in that. And if there is a conflict in a ward or there is an issue within a congregation, or a personality clash, to actually make a decision. Well, I want to be part of this church, but I want to just go somewhere where I feel safe. Actually, is
Yeah.
quite challenging. What was your family's experience of this then? Talk to me about some of the background there.
Okay, so do you want me to talk about what led to the situation of us wanting to move wards, or just a bit about what happened when we had made the decision that we wanted to move?
Sarah, I want you to share whatever you want to share would
Okay,
be.
so there's a lot, obviously, as you know, there's a lot of background to this story. And by the time we moved to the other ward, I think this issue must have been ongoing for about 2 or 3 years at this point. So it was a long time coming. And I'm going to try and give a slightly abridged version of
Yeah.
what happened. Um, but essentially, there was a man in our ward um, who approached a number of people about some high yield investments. This was a very trusted man. He was a high priest. We'd known him a very long time. He'd been part of the ward, as far as I'm aware, all of my life. I don't remember him not being part of the ward. Um, and this then branched out into the rest of the stake. So whilst there was a lot of people within our unit, it affected families across the stake as a whole, who sort of learned about these investments and decided that they wanted to invest money. Um, this man was going to manage the investments. Um, and I just want to make it clear we're talking about a really large sum of money here. So, we're not talking about a few thousand. I think the money in total that was pulled together by everyone was about 800,000, is what that's the number that he recalls. Um, and after some time, so some of this money was being used for the investments. Some of it was being held in a pool account to be used in future investments. And there was an understanding that if anybody fell into financial difficulty from the group, they could request funds from the account to help them out. And then what happened around the late 90s, so we're talking sort of 1999 here, one of the investors who had invested the most amount out of anybody, he had the largest sum in there, requested some financial help. They were going through some difficulties. And the man who was managing these investments and had the access to the account kept fobbing him off. And it eventually came out that there was no money left in the account. Now, some of that was lost in investments. but a sizable chunk of that was pocketed by this man. And this obviously was not the news that people wanted to hear. Because this was somebody that they knew, somebody that they had a relationship with, somebody that they had trusted, they were all very keen to solve this amicably, and to try and find some sort of resolution with this man. They worked with him and church leaders for several months, and this man essentially denied that he'd done anything wrong. He claimed to leaders that he'd needed the money for expenses related to managing the investments, that it was all above board, that the victims simply didn't understand how these things worked, that they were expecting too much, that they were greedy. And my bishop at the time very much believed his side of the story. Leaders, so the stake presidency were involved, and it was very clear they wanted to keep a lid on it. They wanted to keep it quiet. They didn't want this getting out, and they didn't want anything that could potentially be bad publicity or bad press for the church. They continued to want to work on this amicably, but this man was not cooperating. He was continuing to lie. He was continuing to deceive. And eventually they realized that they weren't getting anywhere. The stake leaders at this point fobbed them off and basically said, look, this isn't a church matter. There's nothing we can do to help you. If you insist on moving forward with this, then we suggest that you sue him. And I think the advice to sue was, and I can't say with any certainty because I don't know what their intentions were, but my impression and my parents' impression is that they wanted them to sue because if you sue someone, it's a civil matter, it's not a criminal matter. And so it's less likely to get out into the press, it's less likely to be a big deal for the church. It can be dealt with quietly on the side by the individuals. So the investors met and discussed their options, realised that suing was not an option because to sue someone, you need a lot of money. It's going to cost money. You need lawyers. You're taking on all the personal responsibility for that. And that was not, they've already lost, some of them, tens of thousands of pounds. So they don't have the money to sink into solicitors' fees to try and sue this guy. So they decide in the end that what they'll do is they'll collate as much evidence as they can and they will take it to the police. And I believe my dad was the one who took it to the police, and simply asked the police a very direct question of, is this criminal? Is this criminal activity? Has he broken the law? The police were very interested straight away, and it did not take long for them to arrest the man and begin what was a very, very lengthy police investigation. So this went on. He was arrested and then he was obviously bailed pending a trial. But it took the police 4 years to collate all the evidence that they needed in order to be confident that they would get a conviction. For a variety of different reasons. I know they had issues with banks sharing information and things that was vital to them, red tape that they had to get around. So as I previously said, our bishop was very obvious and very vocal about the fact that he believed we were the ones in the wrong. I know that the stake presidency were very, or rather incredulous, I guess, that the investors had gone to the police because they didn't actually tell the stake president, they didn't tell their leaders that they were going to do this. They made the decision themselves, which, I think they absolutely should have. It is a criminal matter. It's not a church matter. It never should have been dealt with in-house. It shouldn't have been up to the church leaders to solve this. The man committed a crime, and therefore going down the legal route was the right thing to do. was very vocal about the fact that he supported this man, that he believed this man's lies. Um, and this manifested in a number of ways. So he would meet with this man in his office after church every Sunday. He would very publicly hug this man and his wife and show that he was caring for them, that he was supporting them. Um, on the opposite side of that, there were times when my dad tried to shake his hand and he simply refused and walked away. Um, there was a time on I don't think they do this anymore, but back then on a fifth Sunday of the month, we used to have like a joint um, priesthood and relief society, and the youth would come into that as well, and they'd
Yeah.
have like a big thing all together anytime there was a fifth Sunday of the month. So it was a fifth Sunday, I believe. Don't quote me on that. It might have been sacrament. I can't remember. It was a long time ago. But the bishop stood at the pulpit preaching that there were ravening wolves amongst the congregation. And obviously, by this time, everybody knows what's going on. Everyone knows what's happened, and so they know exactly
Yeah.
what he's talking about and who he's talking about. And I remember my dad um, was absolutely furious. And my dad was a very obedient Mormon. He
Yeah.
was very black and white. My dad was the reason why we did all of the things. And, anything, if a prophet said it, we did it. No questions asked. He was a very obedient woman. And he stood up and he told us all to stand up and we walked out. And if I remember correctly, me being a teenager wasn't even really paying attention or listening. So I don't think I actually heard him say it in the moment. All I see is dad telling me that we're walking out and thinking, what the heck? What just happened? Someone fill me in. What did I miss? Um, so yeah,
How
so that
old were
was
you? How old were you at this point?
so at the point that this man was arrested, I was 12.
Yeah.
Um, we So at this point, we're probably talking within the first year that all of this stuff is happening.
Yeah. So you're
Um,
talking 12, 13, that kind of age.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. So
it's
pre-16.
interesting. Just a couple of things I want to pick up on, just from what you talk about. First of all, we started off talking about how our leaders are not trained. And I think that one of the things that we're seeing with this story here is an example of how leaders are not trained. I mean, I doubt it's very common that you have a bishop sitting with a ward, and the thing that comes up is this kind of fraud, embezzlement, and financial irregularity
Yeah.
that was experienced within your ward and in your stake at the time. And without defending that bishop in terms of the way that he was in any way, I also can feel for this guy. I suspect that he was a youngish man, young children himself, with this
Um,
whole
that young
slightly,
actually. But he
yeah,
had teenagers at home. He didn't
yeah,
have young children anymore, but he did still have children at home.
with this whole situation emerging around him. Um, and this has an impact, doesn't it? It has an impact in terms of, you talked about the impact on your family. If we were to go and find the other investors and their families involved, there would have been impact on some of them. I don't know, but I speculate that some of them may have left the church over it, or stepped away. And hurt and pain caused partly through lack of training and partly from what we see in the church of this desire to keep the perfect image of the church externally, along the way that you referred to, that the belief amongst, certainly the belief amongst those people who are affected by this, was to encourage you to take a route to resolve that will keep the church's name out of the situation, and the minimize publicity, and, and those kind of things there. To
And I
be
remember being very,
good.
very aware
Yeah.
of that from quite early on in this situation, being very aware that the leader's primary concern, number one and foremost, was protecting the church. And, when you're 12 and you've been taught your entire life that, your leaders are there to support you, they're there to serve you, they are meant to be some of the most trusted people in your life. And I remember feeling incredibly let down and feeling real cognitive dissonance over that.
Yeah.
Um, Partly because with the bishop, I I believe that he genuinely did think that this man had been wronged, that
Yeah.
we were doing something awful to him, and that's why he behaved the way that he did. I don't think he behaved that way because he's a horrible guy, but I do think he was incredibly misled, and he did not understand the extent of what had happened and the legality of what had happened, and he believed the wrong person. He believed somebody's lies, but that was hard for me because we're taught that our leaders have they receive inspiration from the spirit.
Gives
So
them, gives them discernment.
this man is a bishop. How is he getting the wrong inspiration? How is he not inspired to know what has happened?
Yeah.
And that, really affecting my faith at the time. And also giving me quite a lot of trust issues, thankfully that I've worked through now. But at the time, very much feeling like, well, if I can't, I can't trust my leaders, I can see that I can't trust my leaders. And if I can't trust them, then who can I
Yeah.
trust?
Yeah. So what I'm interested to know then, so obviously this whole circumstances will have had an impact on your family. It'll have had an
Yeah.
impact on your parents and how they were feeling. Your family, your parents obviously were all in, if you like, and were looking for the way to be able to keep being who they were without without it damaging their family more than it had to. As
Yeah.
a 12, 13-year old child, what were you feeling as this is all evolving around you? How did this impact you and your life, your testimony, and your relationship with the church?
Um, so I definitely started feeling some anger at this point. There was anger there. Um, like I said, I'd always been taught that my leaders would have my back, that they would be inspired to help me. Um, and I just didn't feel that from them at all during that time. And that was really hard. And the thing with our bishop felt very personal.
Yeah,
And this was someone that prior to this I had respected and admired and looked up to, and he was the father of somebody that I really love. um and yeah, it felt deeply personal and really sad. And church went from being somewhere that I really enjoyed to somewhere that, like you said, it didn't feel safe anymore. It wasn't a safe place.
okay. And I imagine your parents were recognizing this lack of safety, if you like, in that environment.
And I think, yeah, they were feeling it themselves, and I think they
Yeah,
recognized that we were feeling it as children.
yeah. What was the solution? What did your parents do then? Yeah, talk about what your parents did to give that element of safety for themselves and for their family, whilst being able to remain faithful within the church.
So they decided that the unit that we were attending, which, as you said, it's our assigned unit, and for those that aren't familiar with Mormonism, you are very much expected to attend your assigned unit. You are expected to serve in callings, and you can only serve in callings where your records are held. Your records are held at your assigned unit. Therefore, if you don't attend your unit, unless you are given special permission to attend another unit, you cannot have your records transferred. Therefore, you cannot serve, and that is essentially disobeying God. God wants you to be in your unit and serving the church with your time and your talents. Um, and so initially they approached the state presidency and they did ask for permission. As far as I'm aware, I'm pretty sure they went down that route. They tried to do it that way, and were basically told that that was not an option. At which point they made the decision that staying in the unit that we were in was not an option either. As much as that was what our leaders wanted us to do, I think they recognised it wasn't safe anymore. Um, And I think maybe, I've never asked them this, but potentially maybe they had fears of the knock-on effect of what it was going to do to our testimonies, and would we end up leaving the church and go inactive and things like that. I had older brothers who were sort of mid to late teens and very much at that age where, lots of people do fall away and do stop attending. And maybe they thought that by taking us somewhere else, taking us somewhere that would be safe, we'd be more likely to stay. Um, and so, yeah, the decision was made that we would try three different units in the stake. We'd give a month for each, see where we felt comfortable, and then pick one that would be our new unit. And we were really, really fortunate. We
Yeah, you started to attend another award in your stake, didn't you? Yeah,
we did, and
and
it was a really, really welcoming ward. There was no judgment. There were no questions. There were, everybody in the stake knew what was
yeah,
going on. They didn't really need to use their imagination to figure out why we suddenly weren't attending our unit. But there was never any judgment or insinuation that we should go back there because that's where we're meant to be. We were just welcomed 100% and made to feel like we were part of the ward, like we'd always been there. And it
yeah.
was exactly what we needed at that time. Or
So
at least it was exactly
it's,
what I needed
it's
at that time.
interesting. We talk about the church and this idea of, and you're quite right. We have this structure, and we serve where our records are, and we attend our own unit, and we look to perhaps an experience here that's caused the situation where we have leaders who are sincere but perhaps not dealing with the situation, not getting the inspiration that they need to be able to support the members that are there. Um, your family feeling alienated in your own ward, in your own congregation, and going to another ward. Was that a healing experience? How was that experience for you and your family at the time? You talked about having these questions, feeling anger and concern towards the leadership at the time. How did that help or not as you started attending Cell War?
I think it made church feel like a safe place again.
Yeah,
I think it quieted some of the cognitive dissonance that I had been feeling and
yeah,
restored my faith in leaders as well. I had some really young, really lovely young women's presidency in that ward who were just wonderful to me. And the bishop there was really lovely to our family. In fact, a couple of years later, when we were back attending in our original unit, my older brother served a mission and was not financially, he and my parents were not able to cover the cost of that. And it was this other unit that we had only attended for 10 months that financially sponsored him and made up the funds so that he was able to serve a mission. Just as an example of how supportive they were, and that they still sort of felt and treated us like we were part of the ward even when we stopped attending, and that was
yeah.
really lovely.
And I imagine your family had very maintained very strong relationships with members from this other unit then. Out of interest, again, maybe for an audience that might be in America, particularly in that Utah area, how far away was this other ward from your home? What was the commitment in terms of being able to travel to church there?
Yeah, so it was about a 45 to 50-minute drive. Um, so yeah, it wasn't a small commitment. It's time and it's expense as well. Fuel's not cheap,
Yeah,
and my parents were struggling financially. Um,
yeah,
they wanted us to be fully integrated into the ward, so that meant that we were going there every Sunday. It also meant that me and my brother were attending youth activities once a week there. Um, it was a really vibrant ward in that it was really well attended. There was lots of people, and they had quite a lot of ward activities on as well, and like really good, really fun ward activities. They were sort of known for it. So we were regularly going over there for extra activities with the ward as well. So yeah, it was a big commitment.
yeah. So when you look back on that experience in that war there, what are the highlights? What are your best memories, if you like? What are the best
Oh,
bits?
Um, Honestly, just it was the people that I met. It
Yeah,
was a ward of really, really lovely people there. The youth, I already knew several of them through stake events and things like that, but the relationship that I had with them obviously became much stronger. Um, and yeah, I mean, we'll get on to later on some of the treatment that I received from certain leaders throughout the stake, but the leaders that I had while I was in that ward really were lovely. They were exactly what I expected and wanted my leaders to be. Um,
yeah,
really supportive, really kind, non-judgmental. I never felt shamed or anything like that, which is something that we're going to talk about a lot later on.
yeah,
But yeah, so it was good to have that example and see that there were good people.
yeah. So timeline wise, we're talking about you being 13, 14 at this point. Did you start from church dances? Were you too young for that? How old were you?
Yeah, so I think by the time we moved, I was either 14 or I was just about to, it might have been just before I turned 14, but it was around about that
Yeah,
point. So yeah, I was starting to, go to conventions and go to dances and all of those things.
you were allowed to group date. I still am not quite sure what a group date is, but you were allowed to group date at 14. You know,
No.
um,
So I remember, I've got a funny story about that. I remember I was about 8 years old and we had some really good, a family that we were really close friends with in the church. They had 4 children, the same as us. They lived about an hour away, but once sort of every 2 or 3 months, we'd meet up and we had the best times together. And we were sat in the car one time, and my dad mentions that their oldest daughter, who was 14 at the time, was going on a group date. And mentions, how, and I remember sort of saying, "Oh, well, what's a group date?" Well, she has to date like with a group of people because she's not 16 yet. And I was like, what? My dad was like, well, yeah, because you have to be 16 before you can have a boyfriend. You're not allowed to date until you're 16. And somehow this had completely escaped me. This was the first I was hearing about this. And I remember at the tender age of 8 sitting in that car and thinking that is one of the most ridiculous things I have ever heard in my life. And I remember thinking, well, I'm not doing that.
I, I hear you. I think it's one of those areas where British culture and American culture are so widely
Yeah,
different. I mean, yeah, at 14, you probably might have gone out with your mates, and there would have been some guys and some girls in that group. But that is very, very different from a dating experience. And
yeah,
effectively, in in UK culture, and I'm sure this was similar for yourself, actually, this group dating at 14 line kind of disappears, and the line is you can't date until you're 60,
yeah,
you know. And that realistically is how we view that in here. I'd love if you're an American audience and you've got some comments about the idea of group dating and how it works. Genuinely, put them in the comments. I'd love to read them back because it just doesn't fit in with the way we do things
yeah,
in the UK. And I'm not even particularly defending the UK way of doing things because the UK model, if you like, of dating in society does bring exclusivity in at a relatively younger age. Would be fair to say
yes, yeah,
by having this whole structure here, what it does actually, I don't know, I'd be interested to know your thoughts on this, Sarah, is it kind of that 14, 15, 16-year-old point in our lives, we're discovering who we are, we're noticing people of the opposite sex, maybe noticing people of the same sex, we're having feelings and emotions about those. And trying to deal with, and it's actually a really important formative part of the human experience, is to learn to navigate what a relationship is, how relationships work, and how
yeah.
we interact with people. Do you find that that LDS experience kind of made that more difficult?
Um, well, I mean, I never really stuck to the dating rules. So I guess not really for me. But it did, but that came with its own difficulties because um, this was really when a lot of the shame started to kick in. And there was a noticeable difference in the way that I was being treated within the stake and with many leaders, simply because I was 14 and I started dating a boy in the stake. Um, and I will add at this point, that I wasn't really doing anything that any of my friends weren't doing, but most of my Mormon friends were not vocal about the fact that they were dating, and the adults weren't aware of who was dating who. I thought it was a really ridiculous rule, and I didn't see the point in sticking to it. I should point out at this point that I'm fairly certain that I'm probably autistic. I'm not diagnosed, and I think this kind of feeds into that. My autistic brain was just like, well, that's ridiculous, so I'm not doing it. Um, and it seemed like such a non-issue. It wasn't like I was drinking beer or tea or coffee or doing those things seemed really big to me, and I didn't want to break those. But the idea of not being able to date just seemed silly. Um, but I think some leaders were very surprised at the audacity, I guess, that I had to be so open and honest about it and to not even try and hide it and just, I guess, be an open rebellion against the church, potentially, in their eyes.
So you're youth, you're 14, okay. Have you gone in, if it's on timeline wise, are we back in your original unit, or are we still in the unit that you were moving to? Just a
That's a
bit of
good
a timeline
question.
question.
I've got a feeling that I started attending there that I was attending that other unit, when I started dating.
And I think that's really important because we've got this positive experience attending the second unit, but there's also a lot going on in your family's life about where you should be attending, wanting to be able to faithfully serve. You've been through this ordeal as a family, which has brought that dissonance and has brought those kind of things into your young experience, that you're trying to square these things away. And obviously we've been talking about the idea of group dating or not dating and boys and stuff like that. What I would say is what I'm hearing coming through is the 13th article of faith, and that's we believe in being honest, true, and that very seriously is coming through in there, and you're trying to be honest about what you're doing. You're saying, I didn't see the need to hide the fact
Yeah.
that I was dating. You talked about others. While you were being upfront about this, were you aware of others in your ward or in your stake of a similar age who
Oh,
weren't
yeah.
being upfront?
Lots.
And how did that affect you?
Lots and lots. Um, I mean, it helped to know that I wasn't alone, I guess.
Yeah,
That helped to take some of the shame that was trying to be heaped upon me at this point. Um, yeah, because I knew that, and I'd never felt that judgment from my peers, because I would say the majority of my peers were dating people on and off long before that they were 16. And it was just kind of an accepted thing that most people did. I can think of a handful of people that, really did wait until they were 16, and, fair play to them. That's what they wanted to do. That's great. Um, but I think for the vast majority of us, that was not the case.
yeah. And like I said, I think this feeds into the human experience, that actually we are talking about a time in our lives where we are starting to deal with our own identity, our own sexuality, and learn about who we are. And sometimes I think superimposing a group dating mantra that potentially works in Utah, um, across to the UK, where the culture is very different, kind of stops people being able to do that. And I think it makes it very difficult for us developmentally in this country to build those healthy relationships and identity that we're going to need as we get older and we do start dating and seeking marriage and all those kind of things that are important in society, but highly important within the church.
Yeah, absolutely. Um,
So,
it's worth saying at this point, we're obviously going to be touching on some issues of mental health.
Yeah.
And we haven't brought that in yet, but this is going alongside what we've been talking about. So I started having mental health issues around about the age of 12, not long after the man was arrested and this all came out. And I remember from a very young age being really aware that living Mormonism was going to be tough. I felt like I was not naturally going to be a good Mormon. I'm not meek, I'm not submissive, I'm I'm loud and I'm opinionated, and that doesn't really go toe to toe with what Mormonism wants from its women. Um, and I remember just thinking that I'm going to find this really hard. You know, this is not going to come easy to me. And I remember being jealous of school friends that got to live normal lives and, you know, according to Mormon doctrine, they would get the chance to learn about the church in the next life and get baptized in the next life and still go to the celestial kingdom and still reap all of those benefits. And I remember thinking, you know, I wish I was one of those. I wish I could have just been born into a regular family that did not believe in the church, did not know about the church, that I could just live a normal life and just be me and not try to be what the church is telling me I need to be. Um, and so from quite a young age, I really started to dislike myself deeply. And this gradually grew to, you know, a complete self-loathing, just because I felt like I was never ever going to be good enough. And I believed that the church was true. This is the issue, you know. It's not like I just thought, well, I can do what I want because I don't believe. I really did believe that the church was true, and I really did believe that if I didn't do all of the things, I would be separated from everybody that I love for eternity. And that thought terrified me. I remember from a really young age being so frightened of death because I believed that I would be the empty seat at the table, you know, that my whole family would get to be in the celestial kingdom and I would be the only one that didn't make it. And that's quite a lot to take on as a young child. Um,
What was, again, if this is too personal, say, all right, but you've got, I'm trying to picture a 12 or 13-year-old child who has convinced herself that she is that sinful and that unable to live the gospel that she's going to be the empty seat at the table. What the heck are you doing at 12 or 13? That you perceived made you the empty seat at the table.
um, I mean, it's not even like I was really doing anything at that point that I shouldn't have been doing. Um, that came later on. But no, at 12,
We'll go and we'll explore the later on and things like that, like that in a moment. But I think that that's the point, okay, is that you're 12 or 13 and you've decided internally to yourself that the requirements of the gospel are too hard and you can't do it. And yeah, you get the odd 12 or 13-year-old reprobate that's a bit of a tearaway, but normally if they're a bit of a tearaway, there's probably emotional issues behind why.
yeah.
Yeah, okay. But what the heck can a 12 or 13-year-old child do? What can they actually do that makes them the empty seat at the table? But this was your reality and this was your world. Can you remember about that fact? Were there things that you were doing that you believed were so bad at the time? Can you remember? Was there anything
Um,
about yourself that fitted that category that you labelled as this is why?
so, um, I would say I was quite a horny teenager.
Right, okay, that's one way of putting it. Come on. Yeah, that's fair.
And
Yeah,
although I wasn't acting on it and I wasn't doing anything that I wasn't supposed to do, just the fact that I was having those thoughts,
yeah.
especially as a girl, because we very much received the messaging at church as young women that, boys will be boys, and boys are controlled by their hormones, and boys are going to want to do things that they're not supposed to do. And you girls, you are the keepers of their virtue because you are virtuous by nature. You don't have the same struggles. You are just naturally virtuous. And so it's your responsibility to keep the guys in check. So the fact that I'm having these thoughts, and I'm thinking, but I'm not supposed to have these thoughts. Boys, that is normal for boys to have these thoughts, but it's not normal for me as a girl to have these thoughts. And it's at this point that I start thinking that I'm wired wrong in some way, that there is something intrinsically wrong with me and with the way that I was made, and I am just naturally sinful.
So at this point, as a younger teenager, we are talking about thoughts, thinking about boys, maybe. Not necessarily acting on that, but
And also thinking about girls because I'm bisexual, which I did not even accept myself until a few years ago.
yeah,
And also dealing with a lot of shame around that as well, because the church is very clear on its stance with homosexuality that it is a sin.
yeah.
Um, and
We're
again,
talking mid late '90s at the moment, aren't we? Yeah,
so this would have been early noughties at this point.
yeah. But we're talking at a point in time where the church now will talk about the fact that seems I hate the phrase same sex attraction. All right, but the church will talk about same-sex attraction as being recognizing that that's not a choice, and that you are, if you have same-sex attraction, that is intrinsic to who you are, and that's okay, providing you don't act on it. As
Yeah,
opposed to back at the time when you're a young teenager, you're coming to grips with these emotions, and actually that nuance wasn't there, and it was just a
no,
sin. It was just a sin. So if you were a youngster who is coming to terms with your sexuality, who you're attracted to, what, for want of a better phrase, excites you, I suppose, um, and it's girls, how do you tell about this? Who do you talk to rationalize and understand these emotions, these feelings in you? And what I find really sad is this left a 13-year-old Sarah actually believing that you were going to be the empty chair at the table and that your family would lose you for eternity. And
yeah,
that is hard. That is a really, really hard thing to hear of a 13-year-old child saying that.
yeah,
Have you got any other things that you want to talk about there? And obviously, we know this then affected your mental health. Yeah.
yeah.
Are you able to talk a little bit about how that manifested itself, both to yourself in private and how that was portrayed to the world? How you portrayed yourself to the world as opposed to behind the scenes when you're on your own?
Um, so I had a real fear of people knowing. Um, I, for a long time, believed that. So the gospel teaches us that wickedness never was happiness, right? And when we are sinful, it leads to misery.
Yeah,
And so I believed that my depression was my punishment because I was sinful, and this is what happens when you're sinful. And I thought that if people knew that I was depressed, then they'd know that I was really sinful. And that was a real source of shame for me. And it was really important to me that people didn't know. So the boyfriend that I was seeing when I started dating him, I told him, um, but he was the only person in my life that knew for a very long time. And I compensated for that by being very happy all the time. So when I'm not in private, and when I was around people, I was the life and soul of the party. And at dances, I was the one up on the dance floor, and I was cracking jokes all the time, and everything was funny, and that was very much the persona that I played, and I think I played it quite well. Probably too well for my own good, to be fair, um, because obviously not talking about it and not seeking help is not it's not helpful. And it gradually, this went on for several years before I did seek help, and it gradually got worse and worse and worse.
Were you conscious at this point in your life? Obviously, your mental health was suffering, and you were feeling the depression, and you were compensating that, if you like, with how you were. From our conversation before, from what you're saying, I imagine if someone wanted to volunteer to say a prayer, it was you. If someone wanted someone to go and dance on the dance floor, it was you. If someone wanted to do a talk, it was you. And I imagine that your leaders loved you for it. Because here's someone who is doing all the stuff. Is doing all the things, is ticking all the boxes, is enthusiastic, is first there, doing all this. I'll say that. I'll do that. But this is also the teenager that behind the scenes believes that she's going to be the empty chair at the table. And I think that if we've
Just,
got people who are
I've just got to plug my computer in because the battery's about to die. Sorry.
not a problem.
Why can't I to the other side? Hold on. There we go. Right, sorry.
As I was saying, so I think this is really important for us to reflect on and to consider. You were the life and soul of the party. You were the person. You were everyone from a leader's point of view. You were the model person that you wanted in your class, in your you're not in your quorum because you weren't a young man, and you don't get the privilege of holding the priesthood. You're not that special. Tongue in cheek, of course. But you were the person that was going to say the prayer. You were the person that was going
Oh,
to get everyone else on the dance floor. Um, you told me a story. I'm going to get you told me a story last time we spoke about how you were at a church dance, and you were the one that was being told that you were the person that got everyone was watching, and therefore you need to be extra responsible on the dance floor because everyone else is going to copy you. And there was some negative impacts. Do you remember the story? Are you able to just fill us in on that?
yeah. So, I mean, this is an example of the way that I was often treated by leaders and singled out. Um, so there was a group of, I would say, 25 to 30 of us. It's a youth dance. We're stood in a big circle. We're all dancing. It's the standard. You're kind of moving left to right, and the basic dance that everybody does at dances, or at least everyone did at dances in the noughties. Um, and I mean, I remember always at dances being very self-conscious of my hips because of church teachings around that. Um, and so naturally your hips do move when you're dancing, but I always remember being very aware of that and trying to make sure that they weren't moving too much or that it wasn't like provocative or anything like that. Um, and at some point, I think she was on the State Young Women's Presidency at the time, she pulled me over to the side, and informs me that my dancing is inappropriate, and that I'm setting a bad example. And I remember just feeling really confused because everybody on the dance floor was dancing the same way. And just kind of feeling a bit incredulous of like, why am I being pulled aside and reprimanded for this? When I don't even think I was doing anything wrong because I was consciously trying to make sure that I wasn't doing that. Um, but also everyone else is doing the same thing. So why am I the only one that's being told for this? And I called her out on it and said, well, but everyone's doing it. Why are you just talking to me? And she said something along the lines of, oh, Sarah, you need to understand that you're a leader and people follow your example. And I just remember thinking, like, really? it's not enough that I am responsible for myself, making sure that I'm doing all the right things that at this point already feels like such a mammoth task to me. Now I'm somehow responsible for the actions of everybody else. And if someone else does something they shouldn't, it's not because they're a bad person, but it's because they followed my example and I've rubbed off on them in a negative way. I just remember feeling that that was really unfair.
I think in a minute we'll start to explore some of the other relationship aspects that feed into perhaps those experiences you had with church leaders. But what I'm reflecting on is externally, you're this life and soul of the party. You're the person everyone follows, everyone leads, and everyone knows it. Okay. Um, Behind the scenes, I'm the empty seat at the table. Behind the scenes, you're dealing with trying to get your head around your sexuality, in terms of being bisexual. You're trying to get your head around how this works and interaction with boys and girls of the same age, and how that works. And there's lots going on in the background. Publicly, you're the life and soul of the party. Behind the scenes is very, very different. And I think that there's a important lesson and message for someone who might be watching who works with youth, is a leader in the church. Some of the people that are life and soul of the party are the life and soul of the party. Do you know
Yeah,
what I mean? No, they really are. Okay, and that's important. But this isn't as much as your story is unique to you, it's also not unique.
yeah,
And there will be other youth there at a dance in Huddersfield, Bristol, Southampton, Portsmouth, Aberdeen, Birmingham, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Nottingham, and I could go on, London, Hyde Park. There will be youth at those dances now who are compensating for dealing with their own concerns and worries internally by being the life and soul of the party. Are we aware of them? Do we really know our youth well enough to be able to dig under the surface and give them the support and the love they need and that you needed as a youth at the time? I think there's a really important reflection there that could have been done. And it's back to leaders not being trained. I work in education professionally. I am trained about safeguarding. My team are trained about safeguarding. Teachers and professionals are trained about these kind of areas there so that when a young person is struggling, you learn how to spot them, the changes of behavior, those kind of things there. Um, it's interesting. I go back to 21st century saints and some of the work they're doing around safeguarding at the moment, and really champion the work they're doing to be able to help our leaders become more aware so we can protect young people, such as yourself at that time. Um, that isn't there at all. It's about training good leaders. I imagine that young woman's leader was not a bad person and was
no.
just trying to help you and the other young women in the stake.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And was doing
Does it
what
make
she
it right?
could do.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got this 13, 14 year old you. Um, you've already described how perhaps as a youth you perhaps had a interest in boys and relationships that you perceived at least
Yeah.
others didn't. And I suspect perceived is probably more true to the case rather than the reality. Talk to me about how relationships and how, for yourself and the experience that you had as you navigated relationships as a teenager, and how this impacted on your lived experience in the church.
Okay. So as my depression got worse, I my interest in boys grew deeper. And I think, on reflection, I can see that I was desperately seeking external validation because I wasn't getting anything internally. I hated myself, and so I desperately wanted other people to love me. Um, and obviously, as a girl growing up in the church, I've been taught that essentially my biggest worth, my biggest value is in my ability to find a man to marry me so that I can become a wife and a mother. That's my role. That's what I'm here for. Um, and so I think quite naturally I was seeking that love from boys. That was what I felt was going to give me that validation, that was going to make me feel good. Um, but I'm also getting older at this point. Emotions, hormones are getting more difficult to control. Um, and also, I'm kind of feeling like I have to give certain things to guys because I'm not good enough on my own. Again, back to this, there's no internal validation. I don't think anything good about myself. Why would anyone be interested in me unless I'm giving them other things that they want? And so it's around about this age when, around about the time that I turned 14, I started talking to a boy in the stake. And this was before I started dating the boyfriend, which we'll get to later. But we weren't really dating as such. We were texting back and forth, and we were kind of friends, but potentially considering whether it would be anything more. Um, and at some point, he asked me to send him a very specific photo. Um, and this is my first kind of foray into anything like into this world, you know. Um, and I remember feeling really conflicted and kind of wanting to send it, but also not wanting to send it, but worrying that if I didn't send it, then he would stop talking to me and I wouldn't be getting that attention anymore that I so desperately craved. Um, and so I sent him the picture. And then, without my consent or my knowledge, this picture is shared amongst multiple youth, multiple young men in the stake. Um, and word somehow makes its way to leaders that this photo exists. And at this point, I am called into my bishop's office to discuss the photo, to discuss why I'd done it, to talk about whether or not there needs to be any kind of repercussions for me, how I can follow the rules of repentance to be forgiven. Um, and so this is my first instance of real shame. Um, and this really starts to deepen that self-loathing that I have for myself because I've done this awful thing. I don't think it was awful now, but at the time and in my Mormon mind, I'd done this awful thing. I'd committed a horrific sin, um, and I needed to repent. I needed to be forgiven. Um, but it's just adding to that I'm going to be the empty seat at the table feeling, you know. Um, and I since, after the fact, learned that this photo was also then shared amongst multiple leaders in the stake as well. Um,
Can I comment on that? A couple of comments that I feel are important to make, and a couple of questions for you. Firstly, if you are watching this and you're listening to this story, as personal as this story is for you, our children today in school, this behaviour is normal. And by normal, I don't mean it's a good thing to be sharing these photos. The society we have at the moment and the accessibility to smartphones and cameras and these kind of areas there mean that it is quite common for young girls to be asked by boys of a similar age for this kind of photo. And we need to be aware of that. Okay.
yeah,
It is child pornography. And if someone is caught with that photo on their device, they are guilty of holding child pornography. It is a crime. Point one. Point two, let's put some realsies in this. This is going on in our schools. I know of more than one similar story within the church. Okay. These things do happen. This is back to what I was saying about group dating and taking that away. We are taking the ability for it to be able to teach our children and coach and help our children learn, because we will tell us you don't take to your 16 law of chastity, but we're not having the conversations to equip young people to deal with what to say and what to do when a young man turns around and say, will you send me a photo of? And I think that's really, really important to set a line there. Okay, it is a crime. It is real. There will be youth in whoever's watching this in your ward, in your state today, being asked for those photos by people at school and potentially other youth in your state. And that's harsh. That's not good. But it is life in 2025, and we need to be better equipped to support, coach, and love our children as we deal with it. Having said that, a couple of questions. Okay. You talked about this photo, word came out, and that your leaders became aware, and you talked about the fact that you were called in to speak with your bishop about it. Before you were called into your bishop, had you discussed this with your parents?
No, and my parents were not made aware of it at the time either.
So your bishop was having a conversation about explicit photos that you had shared with other youth in the stake, whatever the
Yeah,
rights or wrongs, legalities of that, you had shared. Is explicit a fair word to say?
yes,
Photo? Okay, an
yeah,
explicit photo of yourself had shared with other youth in the stake, and no one had thought to turn around to say to your parents, this has happened.
no,
All right. Your parents clearly, therefore, were not in a one-to-one interview with your bishop where you were discussing explicit content that you had produced on your phone.
yeah, they
Okay.
were not part of that conversation.
All right. How did your parents become aware of this? Did they become aware of it?
Uh, Recently, I told them this story not that long ago.
When you say recently, are we talking about that you've made them aware because you're aware we might be talking about this here?
No, so we actually, I can't remember how it came up, but we had this conversation about 6 months ago or so. And we talked quite a lot, especially my dad and I, about the church, and various things have cropped up at different times. But yeah, there's a lot that they were not aware of.
Let's go back to the objective we set at the beginning. Okay. Leaders are not trained. All
No,
right. A bishop is not given training on what to do when someone turns around and says, Bishop so and so, I have young Sarah in my ward who has been sending explicit photos. You may want to pick this up with it. If there was training involved, this would involve safeguarding reports. This would involve, and the church, at least in theory, has safeguarding officers in every stake. This would involve potentially conversations with parents because
yeah,
that's appropriate. Um, and addressing you as a victim, addressing you as a victim. All right. Now, the aggressor, if you like, if you're a victim, may be someone the same age, and it may not be in the same category as elsewhere. But we do have a person who has felt it appropriate or acceptable to ask for those pictures. Maybe there's some support that young man needed to be able to change some of what he's doing. But you were interviewed about what you had done in private and about
yeah. And
your.
then I was asked not to take the sacrament for a month as well. And I
So,
would
what did
point
you
out,
tell your parents? What did you tell your parents if you were not allowed to take the sacrament for a month? All right, and your parents don't know. What did you tell them?
so I don't remember that my dad noticed. I
Yeah,
believe that my mum did and asked me, and I told her that I wasn't prepared to share that information with her. Because I was far too embarrassed. I didn't want them to know. As a 14-year-old, I was glad that my parents were not included in that conversation. As an adult now, I'm appalled that they weren't included in that conversation because, like you said, for safeguarding reasons, that is a conversation that should have been had. But no, and I remember, trying to do it as discreetly as I possibly could and just sort of very discreetly pass it slowly along to the next person and hoped that no one actually noticed that I didn't take anything. But
Can you just explain
I also learned, sorry.
for a non-LDS audience that's here? We've talked about this not today. Can you explain why that is a big deal?
Okay, so every Sunday, Mormons take the sacrament. They take bread and water because they don't drink alcohol, so we don't have wine. And that is an expectation because when you make your baptismal covenants, you covenant to believe in Heavenly Father, to follow the principles of the gospel. And the sacrament that you partake of every Sunday is a reminder of those covenants. And so it's a really important part of Mormonism that you take the sacrament. And if someone is not taking the sacrament, it usually signifies either that they're having some kind of crisis of faith and don't want to take the sacrament, or that they've done something that they should not have done and have been told not to take the sacrament as part of their repentance.
And as we said, normally, if someone has been asked not to take the sacrament, then the reason behind is often of a sexual nature. And
Often,
so, if you
especially,
see someone not taking the sacrament in your congregation, there are implications there. And we're talking about a 14-year-old, okay, who's been through this ordeal of photo, now having to be publicly visible in not doing that. How did you feel about that at the time?
so ashamed,
Okay.
so ashamed and
So
terrified.
obviously, yeah, ashamed, terrified, concerned about that. Obviously, at this point, therefore, you've lost your faith in the gospel, haven't you?
Interestingly, no.
No? Talk to me
No,
about that. How does that
I am still fully all in. I believe 100%. Um, but I'm naturally sinful. I already know this about myself at this point. I know that I'm no good. I know that I was born wicked. And so, as much as the treatment sucked, and it, like you said, it really was a public shaming. That's what it feels like. It feels like a public shaming. Um, and as much as that sucked, it didn't make me think that the church wasn't true. I deserved what I was getting because I had sinned. Therefore, the fault lay solely with me in my mind at that time. It's not the church. The church isn't flawed. I'm flawed.
okay? Now, there's a counterpoint. This is you're talking about how you felt internally. Did you ever express the way you were feeling about yourself to your parents or to your family or to anyone that could support that?
No.
And what do you think, if your parents had become aware, what counsel do you think they would have given you?
So they did become aware eventually, and we can
Yeah,
talk about that later on.
yeah, okay.
But
Well, let's pause that and we can revisit that later on then, because I know you got good parents,
yeah,
okay, and I'm sure that when they learned of the way that you were feeling, it probably really hurt them that you had been through the experiences you had and they weren't there and able to give the support that they'd have wanted to as
yeah,
parents.
yeah. I
So,
know my mum struggles a lot with guilt now that she
yeah,
knows things that she did, and I know that if she knew then what she knows now, then
yeah,
things probably would have been very different.
yeah,
My parents were converts. They'd never gone through the youth program.
Yeah,
Neither of them had ever served in youth ever.
yeah,
And some of the things that we were taught in young women's and the way that we were made to view ourselves and think about ourselves, my mum had no idea really that those were the messages that I was getting, and she's been appalled by some of the things that I've told her.
yeah. I have to say, you've talked a little bit about the messaging that's given to young women as regards to your responsibility towards the lads, if you like,
Yeah,
and to making sure that they behave appropriately. Um, I find that, and it's a different scale, is that I was never told that I had a responsibility towards the young women in the same way, and that's
no,
quite scary. But do you know what? The fact that the young women were told that they had to behave and do things in a certain way to protect us, that actually takes some of my responsibility away in a warped kind of way. And I don't like that. I have responsibility for my actions. I can choose whether I'm going to behave appropriately or inappropriately and along the way. And it actually kind of absolves by telling the woman that in some way it kind of warps and takes away my responsibility there. And I don't like that. What I found most interesting is a few weeks ago, since I started doing the podcasting, one of the things I've done with the Come Follow Me piece, which is with the Sunday school, is I've gone and I like to compare what the church is teaching in its manuals today with older manuals. So I've investigated older manuals. I always assumed that the kind of things that you're talking about, and to be clear, we're talking lessons on individual purity in terms of dress code, in terms of the dress codes to um, stop a young woman exciting and arousing a young man and behaving a certain ways. I always assumed that was leaders going above and beyond, and then I opened the manuals. Okay,
yeah.
I've, I never went to your women's. I wasn't invited. I went to your men's where we just messed around, and we played table tennis and badminton and threw darts at each other on a Tuesday night, and then had some good fun activities around it. I didn't go to your women's. I didn't realise that the young women's lesson manuals literally had this stuff in it. This was the prescribed lesson you will teach about a young woman's responsibility towards a young man. It wasn't even inferred because of the way people interpreting it. It was the lesson.
Oh, yeah.
If you went to young women's, you were taught how to be a wife, how to be a mother, how to cook dinner for your husband, how to and I got that these kind of things were happening, but I didn't realise how structured it was.
Mm.
And I find that as a bloke, I find that embarrassing. I
And
find that embarrassing.
bringing that into the issue with the photo, so the young man who asked for the photo and then shared this photo without my consent was not spoken to by his bishop and had absolutely no repercussions whatsoever. So the only person that was spoken to and reprimanded was me.
I'm
And that
assuming he was a
is
different
the
ward.
story that we
Yeah,
hear from women all the time in the church, that
yeah,
women are held to a higher standard. And with the young men, it's just kind of written off as, well, boys will be boys.
yeah. I will say that when I speak to the women in my life about the interviews they've had, the questioning that they've received under similar kind of subjects to me has consistently been a lot harder and a lot more, let's use the word detailed.
Yeah,
I find that a little bit concerning. Um, we could pick over this photo incident. There's so many um, child safety, child progression, protection, safeguarding, and appropriate issues involved in that, not least this photo. The fact that it should have been enough that people are aware the photo existed, even if we're going to go down that road. You don't need to show someone a photo to be
no,
able to be able to explain to someone that a photo exists. And the fact
absolutely.
that priesthood holders in your stake all had the need to see this photo holds all sorts of other questions as well. But let's move on from there because I'd like to think that as inappropriate as it was done trying to do the best that they could. I hope, but that doesn't change the appropriateness of it. And there's and I think that anyone who's listening to this, there's lessons that we can take individually from that.
Yeah.
What happens next in your life?
Okay, so then around about this time, my it would have been not long after that that I started dating the boyfriend. So
Yeah.
and around about the same time, my depression takes another turn downward, and this is when self harm begins. Um, and this is something that's obviously difficult for me to talk about. Um, I believed that I was so wicked that I didn't deserve to live. Um, I genuinely felt like I deserved to die. But as we mentioned before, I was terrified of death. I'd had this deep fear of death for as long as I could remember. And so I remember telling myself that I was too much of a coward to do what I should have done. And so I would have to hurt myself instead. That was the best that I could do because I wasn't able to take my own life. And so that became like a punishment, and a way to punish myself for being who I was, um, and for being sinful and for having thoughts that I shouldn't have. Um, so this is obviously up until this point, I hadn't even thought about doing anything like that, and this comes quite out of the blue. And I think it coincides with, like I said, it was not long after I'd got my boyfriend, and this is when I noticed that I was being treated differently by certain members, that I seemed to have a reputation. I felt like the girl with the scarlet letter. Um,
Can you talk about the treat? You say you're treated differently by other members. Talk about what that looks like. Help us understand how you were treated.
so I remember getting quite a lot of judgmental comments from certain leaders about the fact that I was dating. I should say at this point that the boyfriend was a few years older than me. He was still in youth, but he was close to aging out of youth at this point. So he's 17. Um,
You're 14 still, yeah?
he had a reputation for being a rebel because he
Yeah.
didn't word of wisdom. It was a known fact that he drank alcohol and he smoked, and so I think people automatically then assumed that I was probably doing the same things, um, despite the fact that actually that was not the truth at all. The fact that he drank and smoked was a constant point of contention in our relationship and something that I tried to change in him over and over again. It wasn't something that I was actually fine with. But again, I think I had that mentality of, well, boys will be boys and boys want to rebel, and this is his rebellious phase, but he'll get over it, and then he'll go and serve a mission, and then we'll go and get married in the temple, and it will be fine in the end. He'll turn his life around and everything will be great.
Did you
Um,
believe you were going to marry him then?
sorry.
Were you convinced in your mind at that point that you were going to marry the guy then?
Yeah. Yeah, from quite an early point in the relationship. And I think that was because I wanted stability in my life. And with all the messaging that I'd received as a young woman, it it kind of felt like your life didn't start until you got married. That was when like life begins, and I wanted to move past all the crap that had gone on in the last few years, and I wanted to just be a grown up and to leave all of that behind and be married and have that safety. Um, Despite the fact that it was not a safe relationship. at all, which we'll talk some more about in a bit. But he was a Mormon. He might not have been a very obedient Mormon, but he was a Mormon and essentially could take me to the temple and give me the eternal family that I was desperate to have.
Yeah. Okay.
But like I said, he was so he was the first person that I told about my mental health issues, um,
Yeah.
and I would describe the relationship as toxic. Um, I would describe his behaviour as abusive. Certainly verbally, he was never physically abusive towards me, but verbally he was abusive. And he used, he was very aware of my lack of self-esteem and weaponized that against me. Um, and I think he knew how desperate I was for the attention and certainly played that to his advantage.
So we have this youngster who has this toxic relationship, and I think it's back again. I have to come back to leaders not being trained. That we are relying on our leaders to have discernment, and certainly those leaders around you were, for whatever reason, not able to discern the risk that you were in, and the things that were happening there. We have yourself being labelled, yourself being identified as troublemaker, I guess. Um, Someone that you don't want your kids going to play with.
So we dated for several months, and we were breaking the law of chastity. We were not having sex, but we were breaking the law of chastity. So we were doing other things that the church didn't want us to be doing. Um, but I always had a really hard line around my virginity because the church really focuses on that, this idea of being a virgin on your wedding night and how important it is to retain your virtue until you are married. Um, I grew up in the era where we were learning around. I never read the book, but but we had lessons on it in Young Women's The Miracle of Forgiveness. Just an absolutely awful book. Please don't read it, anyone. Um, and in this, Sance W. Kimball, who was a prophet of the church several years ago, he talks about sexual purity. Um, and basically, he says something along the lines of firstly, that it is next to murder. So, in terms of categories of sin, you've got murder, and then you've got. Well, I understand now that most people interpret that to mean it's like the next one underneath murder. My mind interpreted it as it was next to, meaning it was as bad. So you have sex before you are married, it is the same as if you commit cold blooded murder. That is how sinful this act is. And so, as much as there were other things I was doing that, according to the church, I shouldn't have been, I had a real hard line in the sand about protecting my virginity and keeping my virtue until my wedding night. Um, a little after my 15th birthday, and I should say at this point, this comes about 3 or 4 weeks after I've gone to seek help, and my parents have finally been made aware of the situation with my mental health. Um, so I've just turned 15. My boyfriend has just turned 18, so he is now legally an adult. Um, and one day I went over to his house. His parents and siblings were all out for the day. We had the house to ourselves. We were in his bedroom. We were doing certain things in his bed. And I remember him asking for my consent. for us to have sex. And I said no, because like I said, that was like my hard line in the sand. That was the line that I wouldn't cross. And he asks a few more times, and I keep saying no, and I don't really think anything else of it. Um, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he's inside me. And it happens in a split second. And we talk a lot about fight or flight, but people don't talk about freeze. And in that moment, that's exactly what happened to me. So this happens, and my mind goes straight to, I am no longer a virgin. And at this point, it doesn't even matter if I push him out in that moment because it's already happened and my virtue has already gone, even if I end it at this point. And I just remember in that moment feeling like there is nothing I can do. I can't take this back. I can't rewrite this part of my story. It's done. And I couldn't move. I just couldn't move. Um, and I remember fixating on a spot on the wall and just waiting for it to be over. And then it finishes, and it's time for him to walk me back to the train station to catch the train home. And I can only describe it as having a complete breakdown. Um, I remember that we were walking along a road that had a river next to it, and you could go down some steps to go and sit by the side of the river. And I told him that I needed to go down there. He followed me. He was stood beside me, and I just knelt on the floor and I prayed. I prayed for probably at least half an hour, and all I can remember from that prayer was just apologizing to Heavenly Father over and over again, and telling him how sorry I was, and begging for him to forgive me. Um, and I think that did have an impact on my partner because we actually stayed together for another 6 or 7 months after that, but he never ever asked for sex ever again. So I think he realized that he had crossed a line. Um, so at this point, I'm obviously feeling complete shame. I don't recognize it, or I didn't at the time recognize it as sexual assault, because as much as he had asked my permission and I quite clearly denied the consent and said no, I had put myself in that situation. I was in a house alone with a boy, which we're told not to do. We're told not to put ourselves in situations where things can happen. Um, and crucially, I didn't stop him. Because I froze, I didn't stop him. Therefore, I was complicit. I was as responsible as he was. And this was very, in my head, it was as much on me as it was on him. This was not a fault of his. I wasn't angry at him. I was angry at myself. Um, and now I'm feeling real shame, like real, real deep shame. So in the Mormon church, in order to be forgiven for large sins like this, you have to confess to your bishop. That is part of the repentance process. And I was very much taught that with things like this, if you don't go to your bishop, it doesn't matter how much you pray, it doesn't matter how much you beg Heavenly Father for his forgiveness. If you don't follow those rules, if you don't follow the steps that the church teaches you to follow, then you cannot be forgiven. And so I know straight away that if I want any chance of not being that empty seat at the table, I have to go and speak to my bishop. And this is a man that I do not like, a man that I do not trust. I should say at this point, my bishop has changed. It is a different bishop, and I am now back in my original unit at this point. We went back because the bishop was released and a new bishop was called. The new bishop, whilst not openly supporting the man like the previous bishop had, was very, very much towing the line of protecting the church, and that was very clear straight away. And so, for a variety of reasons, there were certain things that he'd done and that he'd said that meant this was a person I did not trust and I deeply disliked. And I know that I'm going to do. Sorry, which
Was this the same bishop when the photo incident happened? Is it the same bishop?
it was the same bishop as the photo incident. Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted.
No, that's absolutely fine. So I'm also very aware that this bishop has a very low opinion of me. I know that at this point for a variety of reasons, that this bishop does not like me. This bishop sees me very much as the girl with the scarlet letter. I am a bad influence. I'm going to cause, righteous men to fall astray. And, he wants to limit the influence that I have on the people around me. And I know that I'm going to have to go and sit in a room with this man on my own. I'm 15. I'm deeply depressed. I'm hurting myself. And I'm going to have to go and sit in this room with this man and tell him what I've done. And I was absolutely terrified. So I should point out at this point as well that my bishop has been informed of the fact that I'm seeking help for my mental health. He's been informed that I am self-harming, and he's been informed that I'm dealing with suicidal ideation. And it's at this point that I become disfellowshipped. So for anybody who doesn't know what that means, to be disfellowshipped, it means you cannot fulfill callings and you cannot partake of the sacrament. So a bit like when with the photo, I'd been asked not to take sacrament for a month, but this time it was a proper disfellowshipment. I was not allowed to fulfill my calling. Now, we talked about the feeling of being publicly shamed and publicly humiliated by not taking the sacrament. And that was bad. That, I'm not downplaying that. I was terrified of people seeing that. But when you're in part of a large congregation, the chances are it's only going to be a portion of people that potentially see you. It's not the whole congregation. But if you're not fulfilling your calling, now for somebody who's in youth, the chances are you either don't have a calling, or maybe you're like Beehive class president or Maya Maid class president, which means you ask someone to say the opening prayer on a Sunday, and that's pretty much the extent of your responsibility. However, I, at this point, had been called as the ward chorister, which meant for my role, I sat on the stand during sacrament meeting every Sunday, and I did the wavy hand thing and directed the music. And so obviously when I'm disfellowshipped, this then becomes really, really obvious to the entire congregation because I'm not released. I'm just not doing my calling. And in fact, a couple of weeks later, the bishop clearly either had not informed his president and his councillors of what had happened, or his councillors had forgotten, because the woman who was doing it in my place was not there that Sunday. And so across the room, I'm sat waiting for sacrament meeting to start. I'm sat in the pews, and one of the councillors calls across the room and asks me to come and conduct in front of everybody because there's no one to conduct the music. And so in front of everyone, I have to publicly state that I'm not allowed to be on the stand and do that at this time. And so, I mean, that really did feel like I was standing up in the cultural hall, in the chapel, and saying, "Hey guys, I've had sex. Hey guys, I've lost my virtue." But like that's what it felt to me. That's as good as, because if someone is disfellowshipped for a long period of time and you're only 15, there's only really one sin that they do that for. So you don't have to be a genius to figure out what's happened.
We just fellowship full stop is rare. You know, there's so many thoughts I have about what you prefer. Okay, first of all, we are talking about a soul. We are talking about um, this happening without your consent, and we cannot describe it in any other terms than that. That again, a crime has been committed, a serious crime. All right. Um, you didn't recognise that, and that impacts on how that is shared with other people. But if a 15-year-old, and we're talking just 15, not 15, almost 16, we're talking not
We're talking about 3 weeks after my birthday.
okay, we're talking young, right? And the fact that this has happened full stop should have raised questions, not about you, but about the situation and how this has all occurred. Were your parents, again, same questions. You talked about going to your bishop. Had you discussed it with your parents before you spoke to your bishop?
I told my mum because I assumed that my bishop would probably tell my mum. I don't actually know if he would have. Now that I'm thinking about it, they weren't told about the photo, so maybe she wouldn't have been included in the conversation. Um, I was really terrified about my dad finding out. And so I remember saying to my mum, like, above all else, just please make sure that dad is not told. And she passed that message on to the bishop. And my mum and the bishop agreed that my dad would not be informed.
A couple of other things that come to my mind. Okay. And when we talk about quotes and the idea that I can't remember who said it, but the quote was that it's better for you to die fighting than to allow your virtue to be taken.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure that's from the Miracle of Forgiveness as well.
I think so, yeah. And then I want to say Elder Scott, it might be someone else, but it was certainly, I think it was Elder Scott, talks about the idea of if you are a victim, then to talk to your bishop, who will then help you determine your level of responsibility and repentance. Both
Yeah.
frightening comments that lead into the way that leaders in the church respond and act around these kinds of instances. Again, we start off by saying how leaders are not trained. How the heck does a leader without training, a bishop, deal with this in front of him in a way that is going to support the young person involved? How do they do that without training? Um, it's a it's a horrific story. It's a horrific experience um, for you to go through as a young 15-year-old girl, to have had that experience in your life, and the people that were who could have intervened and stopped these things or supported you missed the opportunity. They just missed the opportunity. And that is scary, sad, and reflects on how you were let down as a youth. as we said at the outset, the purpose of this conversation isn't to run down the church. It's not. But we do need to recognise where mistakes are made, and that the leaders involved in the church, they're just human, and they do make mistakes, and they don't have the correct training they need to deal with sensitive issues like this. And they are asked to rely on the gift of discernment. And you've talked about how instances in your life where you would expect a bishop to be able to discern has clearly missed
Yeah.
what he could have discerned. Of course, your testimony's gone now, isn't it?
Nope.
Talk to me about
Nope.
that. How with this experience were you able to continue to hold a testimony and to want to be part of the church?
Because again, I still have that mindset that, well, I've been disfellowshipped because that's what I deserved, and this is what's supposed to happen. I've committed this huge sin. Like I said, in my head, I've done something that is the same as killing somebody. So that's not something that you can just be easily forgiven for. Like I have this mindset that of course I had to be disfellowshipped. Of course there had to be some sort of consequence for what I'd done. And as much as it was really traumatic, again, it was my fault. I'd committed the sin. So the church wasn't at fault. The church wasn't wrong for treating me that way. I was the one in the wrong. I shouldered the blame. It was all my fault.
So how did this then, as a youth, as this episode passes and 6 months later or so you are re-fellowship back into the church and those kind of things there, how is this experience now affecting you, your personal and your church life over the next few years? You're now approaching 16, well, you're up to date, funnily enough. You're now approaching, you're at the top end of youth now. You're not one of the little leagues anymore. You're one of the top end of youth. How's this all playing out for you? What's your experience?
So, following that incident, there were no other, nothing happened again after that. There was nothing where I needed to go and repent or anything like that. And I really, the relationship broke down a few months later. Um, and then I was single. Um, and I was focusing on just trying to be a good Mormon. Like I said, I was getting older now. I'm nearly 16. I'm ready to actually, legally date according to the church. Um, and I've got my sights on finding a good priesthood holder, someone who's, going to be a good example to my children, who's going to raise children in the gospel with me, who's going to take me to the temple. Um, and so actually it's around about this time that I start communicating with a mutual friend, a young man from a ward up north. We hadn't met in person, but he was preparing to go on his mission. So he was a couple of years older than me. And he was going through, like, filling out all of the papers and doing the health checks and all of that stuff to get ready to go and serve. Um, and we were talking, it was quite innocent. We had talked about the possibility of maybe meeting up at some point, maybe going on a date sometime. Um, and at some point, unbeknownst to me, word gets back to my bishop that I am talking to a young man who is currently preparing to serve a mission. Um, and the next thing I know, I receive a message from this young man to say that he can't talk to me anymore. He has to end the communication. And I remember just feeling really confused because, we'd been getting on really well and it just sort of seemed to come out of the blue. And I couldn't really understand like where he was coming from. What had I done? Had I said something? Um, and so I was kind of pushing him for some answers just to explain like what had happened. Why was he saying this? And I eventually get out of him that his parents have told him that he has to cut off communication. And again, I'm still confused because I'm thinking, I don't know your parents. I've never met your parents. Your parents don't know me. They don't know anything about me. You know, how has this transpired? And then it comes out that my bishop has tracked down this young man. He's learned his identity. He's got access to his parents' phone number and has called this young man's parents and basically told them in no uncertain terms, you know, your son is talking to a woman in my ward. I know that your son is preparing to serve a mission. And if you want your son to be worthy to go on that mission, then I suggest you cut off communication with this woman right now. And I remember just feeling shattered by that comment and defeated. Because, you know, we're taught that our bishops, they're judges in Israel, right? And I was always taught that all the priesthood leaders that had served as my bishop during my lifetime would be present for my trial, as it were, as to what kingdom I will end up in the eternities. And I'm thinking, you know, I've already felt for years and years at this point that I'm going to be that empty seat at the table. I'm not going to be good enough. I'm not good enough. I'm wicked. I'm sinful. I don't deserve to be in the celestial kingdom. But still at the same time, desperately wanting that. As much as I thought it was, you know, beyond my reach, it was still very much what I wanted. Um, and I just, like I said, I just felt really defeated and felt like, what chance do I have when this man who gets to say in my worthiness clearly thinks so little of me? And it just, you know, really reaffirmed all the things that I was saying to myself, that I was wicked, that I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't ever going to measure up, that I was never going to be worthy. Um, so yeah. So, and at this point, my testimony's still there. I still believe, and I'm still predominantly blaming myself because, you know, I'm saying, well, my bishop has this opinion of me because it's true. So, can't blame the man for, you know, stating the obvious. Um, Obviously, not that I think that about myself now, but at the time, and but now the anger starts to settle in. So yes, I'm still believing at this point, but I'm starting to feel really angry. And it's around about this time that the 4 years have passed. This 4 year police investigation is now finally coming to an end. So this whole time, that's still been going on in the background, you know, and this guy's still been attending our ward every Sunday. In fact, when I was called as ward chorister, so I was ward chorister for a year and a half, for the entirety of that time, his wife was the ward pianist, which meant as I sat up on the stand, his wife and him sat in the front row pew directly opposite me. And I had to look at this man every Sunday and serve with his wife and work with his wife. Um, and I'm, you know, so all of that's coming to a head as well. I'm starting to get really angry at the way this whole thing has been handled by leaders. The fact that it's been 4 years and I have never once felt supported. As a child in this situation, it's been 4 years. Not a single leader has ever asked me how how are you doing with it? How are you coping with it, Sarah? Has this had any impact on you? Nothing. Nobody. Um, I think you know, I felt very much just completely forgotten about and like I did not matter to them at all. Um, and I think especially once we then had the trial, so the trial took place shortly before my 16th birthday. He was found guilty. He was sentenced to jail time. Um, and so that was then, as much as I'd obviously always believed what my parents were telling me about what was happening and what had gone down, that's then the proof, isn't it? That's, that's the validation that, yeah, he did commit a crime. He did something that was really bad, and we've got all the evidence. Like, they've proved it beyond a shadow of a doubt that he did these things. And so now that that's finally over, the anger now really starts to set in. And a few months later, I I remember I was sat in my sister-in-law's car, and my brother at this time was on a mission. So she was my brother's girlfriend. She's now his wife. Um, and we were sat in her car, and I had a text message from my mum to say that she just got off the phone with the bishop, and the bishop wanted to see me on Sunday, and that I was to go to the bishop's office after sacrament meeting. And I remember it was an instantaneous response. It was an immediate response of, no, I cannot do that. And as much as I still believed that the church was true, I just remember in that instance thinking, I would rather spend eternity in the terrestrial kingdom than spend another minute in that office with that man. And that was it. And I messaged my mum and I said, that's it, I'm done. The bishop will not be seeing me on Sunday because I won't be at church, and I won't be at church any longer. And I didn't recognize it at the time, but looking back now, I can see that was very much a trauma response of just, no, I cannot do that. I absolutely 100% cannot and will not do that. So yeah, that brings a temporary pause to my church life.
I hope that there are people within the hierarchy and leaders from the church that hear and listen to this interview. And I'll explain why. All right. And first of all, thank you. I mean, we've got some other areas we'll talk about further down the line, but at the moment, we've reached a story where a 17-year-old young woman.
16 at this point. I've just turned 16.
Yeah, so you're 16 at this point, yeah?
Yeah.
Has decided to leave the church or not attend church anymore. We have a story of a 16-year-old girl who has been through, it's blunt as I need to be, who has been raped, who has been victim of indecent images of herself being passed around the youth of the stake, and frankly the leaders of the stake as well. We have a story of a young woman who has had suicidal ideation. We have the story of a young woman who is self-harming. We have the story of a young woman who is trying to deal with her her sexuality, sexual attraction, and understand her place in the world. We have a story of a young woman whose family have been through some very difficult times within the ward and the congregation they attended. We have a story of a young woman who's been let down. Seriously let down by a leader who I suspect even the bishop who you didn't get on with, and I understand why, was not necessarily a bad person, but hadn't been trained and didn't have the experience to be able to deal with it. State leaders who didn't have the experience to be able to deal with the things that happen to you. Then you could try to spot the safeguarding signs that may have protected you.
Yeah.
Why do people leave the church? We haven't mentioned, discussed, or analysed a single truth claim of the gospel. We haven't talked about whether the Book of Abraham is real. We haven't discussed whether Joseph wrote the Book of Mormon or whether he made it up. We haven't discussed polygamy. We haven't discussed any of those truth claims of the church that people pick on as people leave the church at all. We've not got someone in front of us who wants to sin. We've not got someone in front of us who has been, well, actually, yeah, you have been offended, and I think you have every right to be offended, to be fair, all right, but isn't taking casual offence and deciding they don't want to play anymore. We're talking about someone who the structures and lessons and the way the church went about and still goes about working with our young people has caused harm. One of the things that you stated at the outset was to understand, active members to understand how the church can cause harm. And if you are that person, I want you to pause and reflect on what you've listened to today. Okay? And this isn't an attack on whether the church is true or not. At this point at 16, you've even said, Sarah, I stopped going to church. I didn't believe the church wasn't true. I just couldn't be there anymore for your own sanity, for your own mental health and your own well-being, that you weren't able to be there anymore. You haven't turned around and told me, I didn't believe the church was true and therefore I stopped going to church. You just accepted your space in the celestial kingdom, accepted that that space at the table would be empty.
Yeah.
I'm going to put a poll. When I put this online, okay, we'll place it on Spotify and we'll put it into YouTube. If you're watching this, what I would like you to comment is if you, as a youth, as someone who grew up in the church, ever felt that you were going to be the empty seat at the table. So I can tell you that as a youth and a young single adult, I perceive myself as the person that wouldn't be at the table. That's not my story today, so I'm not going to talk in the background on that. And I hadn't even done anything seriously wrong any more than you had. You know, go deep for God's sake. Yeah, but I looked at my mistakes that I perceived, and I believed I would be the empty seat at the table.
And I think it's quite common.
And I think it's quite common. So if you're watching this, come into the comments and tell me whether you were an empty seat at the table. Please do it. All right? Please be active and thoughtful in doing that. If you weren't an empty seat at the table, come in the comments and say, I wasn't an empty seat at the table. If you were, tell me that you were. All right? I don't need you to explain why. I don't need you to talk to me about the story behind that. But just tell me whether you were or weren't. On Spotify, I have the ability to put out a poll. I've never put a poll on Spotify before, but if I can make it work, I'm going to do so. Please go into that poll and tell me whether you've ever felt that you would be an empty seat at the table. Because I think this is important. Because too often, our youth and our young people, particularly, are going through their life believing that they can't win. With a faith and a testimony devoted to the gospel of Jesus Christ, wanting to be the person that they've been taught all their life to be, looking for that exaltation, but convincing themselves, internally or to anyone else, that they cannot succeed and they will be the empty seat at the table. And I would love to know, if you're watching this, please be mindful, just whether you were or weren't, whether you were the empty seat at the table as well. If you're from the church and you're watching this, pause, reflect. These 21st century saints are living. Those last 21st century saints, they understand safeguarding. And if as a church you want to do better, and this story fits in the can do better category, they can tell you exactly what to do. And they can help. And that isn't a slight on individual bishop. That's not a slight on the church. It's truth claims. It just is can do better. And we need to do better. Our youth need us to do better now.
Absolutely.
Okay, so yeah, round over. Let's come back to this. You're now less. How long are you less active for?
So I was less active for 5 years. Had a great 5 years. I remember feeling, I mean, almost instantly, the shame just disappeared. And I just, I embraced my new life and I loved it. I had a really wonderful 5 years. I had lots of fun. Um, and I really started to heal, and all those thoughts of not being good enough, not being enough, not being worthy, they all started to just disappear. And in my new life, I wasn't, and I had great friends, and um, I started dating my ex-husband, um, who was obviously not a member of the church. Um, and yeah, I I didn't feel any shame anymore, even though for a long time I did still believe that the church was true. Somehow, not being there every Sunday and not actively taking part in anything related to the church just allowed me to be myself, to explore who I was, to figure out who I was. And that's what you should be doing at that age. And at this point, no longer trying to fit myself into that tiny little box that the church said I needed to fit into, and who was I outside of that, and what goals did I have outside of that? What did I want to do outside of that? And in all honesty, at that point, there was definitely a time when I didn't think I would ever go back to church because I was very conscious that my mental health was so much better outside of it, that I was doing so much better outside of it. Um, but time moves on and indoctrination.
Well, you're about to tell us about from that church. I've got a couple of questions for you first.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. You leave the church. Obviously, you rang your mum that day and said that bishop was not the senior in the office, so that you weren't going to step back inside the building again. The parents you've talked about being all in, very faithful, very committed members of the church. How did they handle that?
Um, I mean, I was very aware that it would have been a huge disappointment to my parents. I don't ever remember them vocalizing that to me. They didn't need to vocalize it to me because I'd had a lifetime at this point of I was fully aware of how important it was to them, how much they believed it, how much they wanted us to stay in the gospel. However, at this point, so I'm the youngest of four, and two of my siblings are already out at this point. So they've gone through it before. This isn't new. Um,
Yeah.
and in fact, those two siblings had been out for probably a couple of years at this point. So it wasn't even like fresh. They'd both been out for quite a while. Um, and so I think my parents just accepted that they might not have liked it, but they didn't really have a choice because it was my choice to make.
So you're allowed the free agency or moral agency, I think is
Yeah,
what calling it these days,
I was.
to be able
I was still
to
16.
make that choice.
Yes, technically, they could have forced me to still go on Sundays, and they could have taken privileges away if I didn't attend and things like that. But they never ever did that. Um,
Yeah.
I think and that was something they'd always said to us growing up was that our testimony was ours, and that we couldn't survive on their testimony, and we had to have our own testimony. And so, as much as it wasn't the choice that they wanted me to make, they fully accepted that it was my choice to make. It was not a choice that they could make for me.
Yeah. Okay. The other thing I wanted to ask you, and just explore very briefly, you expressed having 5 great years outside of the church. What were the highlights?
Oh, well, I went to uni. I loved my time at uni. Lots of really good memories there. Um, and yeah, just the highlight was just being able to be authentically myself in a way that I'd never been able to be before. Like we said, there's so much expected of you within the gospel, and you are supposed to be a certain type of person and do a certain type of thing. Um, and it was really, really lovely to not have those constraints on me anymore, to feel free to make my own choices, and to be surrounded by people who weren't judging me for any of that.
Yeah.
I could go out and have a drink with friends and nobody was thinking like, oh, you shouldn't be drinking, or I could spend the night at my boyfriend's house and nobody's telling me that I shouldn't or that there's anything wrong with me doing that. Um, so yeah, that was the best thing for me. Just being free to make my own choices.
Another question for you about that. It sounds like you had some great experiences as you transferred into adulthood, if you like. But one of the things that when I speak to people who perhaps leave the church, particularly from the age, but older as well, all of a sudden there's a whole lot of things that were forbidden from you. When we're talking word of wisdom and potentially blood chastity as well, that all of a sudden, all the cards. And I think when you grow up in the church and these things are all restricted, all of a sudden they're not anymore. How did you handle that?
So I think in some ways I'm quite lucky in that I don't massively have I don't actually have an addictive personality. So I would smoke socially if I was out drinking with friends, but then I wouldn't smoke for months. I enjoyed a drink, but never really to excess. I had the odd nights where I'd accidentally go a bit too far and drink. We've all had those moments, I think, where obviously I don't know if you drink, but there's definitely times when you sort of sat down and you don't feel it and you have a few and then you stand up and all of a sudden you realize that you've had one too many and you probably should have stopped a couple of drinks ago. But generally speaking, I'm naturally quite a sensible person anyway. So, I was never going out and putting myself in dangerous situations or doing anything massively to excess. Um, and that's just my nature. I think I am cautious with certain things. So when I first had my first drink, I made sure I was with someone that I trusted that would look after me in case I took it too far or anything like that. And I was just sensible with my decisions.
Yeah. But you also had possibly able to get a different view on the world around you as well. Okay, I feel I cut you off to ask you those questions, but you were about to say something along the lines of, and then I decided to go back.
Yeah. So indoctrination runs deep. And like I said, I was really happy. I had no real thoughts or intentions of going back for several years. And then I get that bit older. I'm now in my final year at university. I'm engaged to my ex husband. We're getting married straight after graduation. Um, and this is when I first start to think maybe I need to go back. Not necessarily because I thought it was true, because at this point I didn't know. I'd been gone for 5 years. I hadn't really thought about it that much in 5 years. And so at this point, I've got no idea if the church is true or not. But there is still that part of my brain that's going, but what if it is? And if it is true, then I probably need to go back. And I need to figure out if it's true or not. And if it is, then I need to do what I need to do to repent and start that journey down the straight and narrow road and cling to the iron rod and do all of the things. So yeah, so that's what I decide. I decide to wait 6 months because at this point I'm living with my fiance and I've got absolutely no intention whatsoever of changing that living arrangement. Logistically, I couldn't change that living arrangement. I'd moved out of home. My parents had downsized. I physically couldn't move home with my parents. I couldn't afford to live anywhere by myself. I'm a student. Um, so, changing that situation is not an option. Um, and I knew that obviously going back, there's no way I was going to go back to church while I was living with somebody that I wasn't married to. I'd done the whole shame thing in the past and I wasn't going back to that. So I made the decision that I would wait until we were married and then I would go back and I'd figure out whether or not I think this is true. Um, so yeah, I go back, and it feels really good. It feels like coming home. This is the community that I grew up in. I'm in the same unit that I grew up in. These are the same people that have known me since I'm a baby. Um, and there was definitely a bit of love bombing, and I'm not using that as like a complaint against people or saying they were wrong to do that. I think it was genuine. I think people were genuinely really happy to see me come back into the fold, and wanted to be really accepting of me. And that felt really good and affirming. Um, and so I start to think, well, maybe the church is true, because I'm feeling good being here, and that's a good sign. Um, And so, yeah, bit by bit, the testimony kind of returns. And after about 4 or 5 months, I make the decision that, yeah, like I'm back, I'm properly back, and I'm going to do all the things, and I'm going to stop doing the things that I'm not meant to be doing, and I'm going to be a really good Mormon woman and be an example. And, um, obviously at this point, I'm married, I've got a non member husband, so there's that to take into consideration. Um, but yeah, it felt really good. And then crucially, and I think this is so when I go back, I was in for 4 years, and I spent 3.5 of those years serving in primary.
It's the best place to serve. I have to say that. I've got a couple of questions for you, which I'm going to ask in a second. But I will say that primary is awesome. Over my time in the church, my career in the church, if you like, has had of all places stake and world level callings and leadership callings. The best calling I've had was the primary music leader. And
Yeah.
calling was amazing. I got to stand at the front of the primary class and sing songs with the kids. And did I spend ages picking up for it? No, because I am just an over exuberant personality. I know my primary songs, and me and the primary kids, we had an awesome time. I'm not sure if it was a bit more, probably. Um, but yeah, primary is an amazing place to work with the youngsters there.
Yeah, I absolutely loved my time in primary. Loved it.
You said your husband obviously is a non-member. How did he react when you said, I go to church?
So I don't think he was overly surprised. He obviously knew that we'd talked about my upbringing. I knew him through my brother. He'd been my brother's best friend for many years. So he was well known to my family. He was very aware of the fact that we went to church on Sundays. Um, so yeah, I don't remember him being particularly surprised by it. Um, I remember him saying quite early on that, this isn't for me. This is not something that I'm interested in. It's not really something that I want to learn about. Um, but he was really supportive of my right to go. He was happy for me to do that. There was no contention between us on that issue. It was just very respectful. He respected my right to choose to go to church, and I respected his right to choose not to.
Yeah. Okay. Talk to me about being back at church. Obviously, you come back as an adult. You're serving in primary. When did you go to the temple?
Okay, so yeah, I went through the temple about a year after I started coming back to church. So at this point, it's only really sort of 6 months after I've made the commitment of yes, I'm really back. I'm here, and I'm doing all of the things. And I've probably been in primary for about five months at this point, I guess. Um, and yeah, I made the decision that I wanted to go through the temple. I don't remember anyone ever bringing it up to me. It was very much I'd decided that I wanted to do that. Obviously, most women go through the temple and receive their endowment either prior to going on a mission, if they serve a mission, or if they don't serve a mission, then they go prior to getting married so that they can be sealed in the temple with their spouse. Obviously, neither of those things pertained to me, and I was already past that point. So I sort of figured, well, I guess it's up to me to decide when I want to go then. It's not going to be triggered by one of those events, because those events aren't going to happen. And I felt really ready to go. Obviously the temple is something that I'd been singing about going to the temple since I was 3. And how much I couldn't wait to be there. And I felt really ready to take that next step. I didn't really know a huge amount about what happens in the temple, and what's involved in the endowment. And that's, very purposeful. You're not told what happens. It's very much a case of, well, this is, sacred, and you'll learn about it when you get there. Um, but yeah, I was really, really excited to go to the temple. And um, there's a really lovely story of my first visit to the temple. So my mum at this point, I should state that in my time of my period of inactivity, my dad has gone through his faith crisis and has exited the church at this point. So he's already inactive. My mum is active, but is no longer a true believing Mormon. She knows all the things that my dad knows. She knows things about the truth claims and about Joseph Smith, and she definitely has questions and doubts. Um, and she kind of has one foot out the door, and has had one foot out the door for a little while. And this is common knowledge in the ward. Everyone kind of knows where she's at. And so for various reasons relating to that, my mum did not hold a temple recommend at this time. And she had no desire to hold a temple recommend. So obviously, ordinarily, your mum would be like your companion. That would be who would take you through the temple for your first trip. That obviously couldn't happen. And so a really good friend of mine, um, I asked her if she would take me through. She'd be my escort. She was obviously more than happy to do that. And she lived up in London at the time, so I'm still down in the southwest, and she's in North London. So it was agreed that we'd meet at the temple. And I remember that she got there early so that she could get changed and like greet me all in white as I walked through the door. And we're sat, I explained to the person on the desk that I'm here to receive my endowment. And she tells us to go and sit down on this chair, that someone will come and get me and kind of explain the process and what's going to happen to me. And this lovely lady, she must have been 70s, 80s. I'm pretty sure she was American. And she's likely serving a temple mission. And she comes over with this big smile on her face, and she's like, "So, darling, mission or marriage?" And I remember in that moment feeling instant shame. It was the first time that I'd felt shame since going back, because I had to explain that actually I wasn't there for either of those things, because I'd been inactive and I was married to somebody who was not a member, who was not going to take me through the temple, um, and feeling quite worried about what her response to that might be. And so I start explaining the situation, and I think she could probably tell that my voice was shaking a bit. I was, talking quite quietly. I was obviously feeling just quite ashamed in that moment. And and I remember that she just grabbed my hand and she goes, "Oh, how wonderful. You're doing this for you." And I remember just in that instant, it completely reframed the way that I was thinking. And straight away I thought, yeah, that's right. Actually, this is amazing. I'm not doing this because I'm not doing it because I have to, because I want to go on a mission, or I have to because I'm getting married. I've made this choice for myself, and I'm doing this for me and only me. And that was actually really empowering.
It's interesting. We talked about the idea of the gift of discernment. The one place we can talk about discernment was not physical.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Did you have you feel at the temple when you went? Did you enjoy it?
Um, yeah, I did. I'm really aware from conversations with so many other ex-moms that the temple is a really difficult topic, and a lot of people really struggled when they went through the temple the first time. And I completely understand why they struggled. I get that completely, um, especially as a woman, when you very explicitly are having to, covenant to your husband as your husband covenants to God. And the the line of the priesthood is very clear that, the men have access to God, and we just get access to the men. We have to access God through our husbands. And I remember initially just feeling confused, because I thought, well, where does that leave me? Because my husband isn't a priesthood holder, and therefore my husband does not have this direct line of communication to God. My husband has not covenanted to God. He's not making these covenants. I'm making these covenants. And how do I covenant to my husband as my husband covenants to God if my husband is not covenanting to God? How does that work, and where does that leave me? Thankfully, at this point, so when I was a teenager and a child growing up in the church, I believed everything very literally. Um, when I came back as an adult, I was extremely nuanced. My experiences in the church as a teenager had kind of forced that. There was lots of things that I didn't buy into. I knew that my leaders were flawed. I knew my leaders could make mistakes. I didn't necessarily think it made them awful people, but I didn't buy into this whole my leaders will never lead me astray, and my leaders will always have the discernment of God, and they'll always know what they're talking about, and they'll always say the right things. And and there were certain things by this point around teachings on homosexuality. I was entirely convinced that the church was wrong. I believed that it was similar to how when black people previously had not been allowed the priesthood, and then at some point the church realizes its mistake and it doesn't apologize, unfortunately, but does change the policy on this. And I thought that it would be the same with homosexuality, because it was very obvious to me, this is not a choice. This is not, this is how people are born. It is how they are made. And if we believe that God made us, then God makes people gay. And how can an all-loving God, who wants the very best for us at all times, how can he make people gay, but then tell them that that's a sin, and tell them that the only way they can be with him forever, that they can gain salvation, that they can, have their eternal family and all of that, is by either being celibate, not spending a lifetime without companionship, without that love, or they have to somehow make a mixed orientation marriage work and marry someone of the opposite sex who they are not attracted to. And that just made no sense to me. That I couldn't align that up with the loving God that I believed in. And so I really did, there was lots of things like this that I didn't take literally. There were things that I genuinely believed that the church was wrong about, and that, I had faith that that revelation would come one day and that change would happen. I lived in hope of that. And so my nuanced brain takes over at this point that I'm sat in this temple ceremony going, well, where does that leave me? How do I covenant to God if my husband is not a priesthood holder? And my nuanced brain just goes, do you know what? That's great. I guess I just get to cut out the middleman. I guess I get to covenant directly to God. The other women don't. Sucks for you. But I guess I just get to go straight to myself. That's awesome.
I like that a lot. Can I read you something? Can I read you something? And you probably will recognise it quite quickly. Feel free to take over if you do, and if you can.
Okay.
All right. We are daughters of our Heavenly Father, who loves us and we love him. We will stand as witnesses of God at all times and in all things and all places, as we strive to live the young woman's values,
which are
faith, divine nature,
individual worth. You're going to have to keep going with me because I can't remember it all.
Knowledge, choice and accountability,
integrity,
good works, integrity and virtue. We believe as we come to accept and act upon these values, we're prepared to strengthen the home and family, make and keep sacred covenants, receive the ordinance of the temple, and enjoy the blessings of exaltation. Now, I do have to read that. I was there a young woman. All right. Funnily enough, the latest iteration of this, which they used since 2019, there is a version which is used for the young men as well, and the young men do also recite an equivalent. It's reworded quite massively, and the young men now do have an equivalent. When I was a young man, there wasn't. And in fairness, I left youth before. I'm 20 years older than you, apparently. I'm going to be 21 this year. Um, and the version that is there, that version came in 2001, yeah, and 2008. Why have I brought that up? Okay, this would have been the backdrop of your young women's every single Sunday.
Oh yeah, we
The
recite.
first thing
We
you do,
opened our women's by reciting their women's theme every single week.
the first thing you do is you stand up and recite this. Every activity ties into one of those values. Yeah, your personal progress and your little medallion or whatever it is you get is tied into these things here. This was the backdrop of your young woman's experience. Okay, and where I wanted to pick up was you've gone to the temple. Okay, we prepare to strengthen home and family, make and keep sacred covenants, receive the ordinance of the temple. You've done that, and enjoy the blessings of exaltation. The blessings of exaltation rely on a celestial marriage. Rely on you being sealed to your husband in the temple. You had a husband who wasn't a member of the church. He already told you that whilst he supported you, he's not interested, which is fine. Yeah. And therefore, in your family dynamic as it existed, the key last sentence of that young woman's thing or motto, and the crowning point of the ordinance of the gospel and the sacred covenants we make is not available to you. How did that sit?
So again, um, this is very much where my nuanced brain comes into play, because I have to admit that I was not aware of the church's official doctrine about what happens if you are not married to a priesthood holder in the temple. So for those who aren't aware, the the gospel teaches that if I were to die and my husband had not joined the church and we were not sealed in the temple together, then my marriage to him would effectively be over. Till death do us part. We're dead. That's done. And in order for me to gain access to the celestial kingdom, I would be given as wife number 42 to a man who was a worthy man who was going to the celestial kingdom. And yeah, we would be living polygamy. There would be multiple wives. I would be sharing that husband with other women potentially, and I would have his babies eternally, essentially, and we would create worlds and create multitudes and multitudes of children. I was not aware that that was the official church stance. That was what the church taught about what would happen to me. And I very much believed that that it would be worked out in the eternities. I felt like my husband was a good man. I still feel that way. He's my ex-husband, but he's still a good man. He's a friend. Um, and yeah, I felt like he was a good man. We had a good marriage. Um, and I didn't believe, again, coming back to this, I very much believe in this idea of an omnibenevolent God. I very much believe that my Heavenly Father loves me deeply, as he does all of his children. And so, again, I can't team that up with a God who is going to separate me from my husband for eternity simply because my husband didn't believe in him. Was a good person, good deeds, helped
Can I make it
people.
worse? Is
Sorry?
that okay? Can I make this worse for you?
Oh God, go for
Okay.
it.
Right. Now, in fairness, if we look at the doctrine, it doesn't specifically state about having babies. We talk about having worlds without end, and we talk about being kings and princesses together, and a lot of how you describing what that looks like is inferred rather than doctrine.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, all right. Just to be clear for anyone who's watching it, although it's a reasonable inference, I would suggest. All right. However, you are right in what you say is that if you were to be qualified for exaltation and didn't have a husband to be exalted with, you would be given somebody else. And that may well be as a polygamous wife of that husband. There's nothing to say is or isn't. However, when I say make this worse, actually, your kids are your kids. They're your kids for eternity. But this makes it worse for your husband, to be fair, for your ex-husband, because if he, if you are sealed to somebody else, those children will be sealed to the person you're sealed to, not your husband. So your husband loses his children for eternity. That's harsh. And that's what the doctrine's actually. If you actually look at the doctrine and understand that if you are sealed to somebody else, then your children will be sealed to that person, not your husband. And I think that's cruel. We see this in.
Doesn't correlate with a God who loves everybody, because, like I said, that is harsh. You're talking
Yeah.
about this person who's been a good person, who's been a good father,
Yeah.
being
When
denied
we
any
talk about
access to his children, and basically, essentially, those children become somebody else's.
mm, when we talk about Joseph Smith and polygamy, and this isn't a conversation about Joseph Smith and polygamy, it's just an observation. Very often people get caught in a debate around whether those ceilings were for time, whether they were for eternity, whether they were ceilings, whether they were eternal ceilings, whether they were in life only, or whether not, whether they were consummated, whether they're not. Okay. It doesn't change the fact that if we take people like Helen Mar Kimball or Lucy Walker or any of the wives that he had who were married already, when they meet, fall in love, have children, their celestial eternal sealing is with Joseph Smith. So whoever they are, faithful or not, those husbands, their children, their marriages are for life only. They're not for the eternities, and the children that come from those marriages belong to Joseph, or to Brigham, or to whoever the priesthood holder is. Whether these marriages were sexual or not, whether they were just for eternity, whatever the semantics about it, that is the reality of how that affects your children. Maybe that's going a bit deep, but let's bring us back to where we were. We were talking about how you saw that, and I guess you were seeing a nuance in there,
Yeah.
um, in those kind of things there. And what I'm hearing is that you actually love the temple experience. So often we hear these conversations, and people are like, didn't like that. And I hear that, and I haven't been to the temple and understand what the temple was. And I went to the temple in 1999, I think.
Okay.
So, so, a lot more personal than it is now.
Mm.
Will be fair to say. I loved it. Okay, I loved it. It appeals to my sense of ritual. It appeals to my sense of those kind of things. There for me, it was great. I also was a bloke, so I got to come up with God. I had to come up with my wife, and I didn't really think my husband. I didn't really have to think about those kind of things. So, but I do understand why other people find it traumatic, and I'm not trying to take that away. For me, it was an experience that I really. One of the things I love most about them, in the church. But it's interesting how that fits and interplays with your family dynamic and husband, the romance in the relationship. Having been to the temple will have an impact,
And then you
and
come
those
home
kind of
with a
things.
brand new set of underwear that are not particularly attractive. Yeah, so I did warn him about that in advance. I thought I can't just come home from the temple and be like, ta-da! So yeah, he was very much warned about that in advance. Um, I, and I tried to kind of describe the garments to him and what they would look like, without giving too much away either, because there is so much secrecy around the garments and around temples, and I wasn't sure like how much I was allowed to say and what I wasn't supposed to say. But I also kind of figured, well, but he's going to see them eventually anyway. So yeah,
So
so I
you
was
were,
kind of really weighing what am I allowed to say, what am I not allowed to say, but I want to prepare him for it. Um, and I think I probably went too far the other way, because I remember coming home from the temple and showing him the garments, and him just being like, oh well, that's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. I think I'd made it sound like so awful that actually the reality was like, oh well, actually, okay, they're not the most attractive of things, but they're not horrific either. Like I can live with it.
yeah, I mean, the temple does put some practical implications on life. But what I'm hearing then is you've gone through this experience as a youth. You're now returned, and you're now all in, and
Yes.
you're loving it. Your testimony is restored. You're serving in primary. You're singing "Jesus wants me for a sunbeam," and the wise man built his house upon the rock, and
Yeah.
and trying to be like Jesus. Still one of my favourite songs. You know, life is good. I'm assuming when I say life is good at this point, life was good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I loved Sundays. I loved being in primary. Um, I, like you said, I was all in. I was very nuanced, um, but at the same time, I was very committed and very devoted. Um, And yeah, I absolutely adored primary. I had no interest in the nitty gritty doctrine, hence why I didn't actually know the church's doctrine on what would happen to me after I died with regards to my non member husband, because I really just wasn't interested in any of that. Um, I had a really kind of simplistic view of the gospel, and I felt like I believed that the gospel in its purest form was really just about being a good person, loving people, being kind, helping others, serving others, leaving the world a better place than I found it. Um, and I was really lucky to serve in primary with uh, the president and the other counsellor. The other counsellor happened to be my mum, and the president was a friend of ours, and we all had a really shared vision for primary, in that we really wanted to just focus on those core gospel principles. We wanted the children to know that they were children of God, that were loved, that they were special, that they had worth and value, and that they needed to be kind. And that was at the forefront of every lesson that we taught, every activity that we ran. Everything was dictated by this focus on you are loved, and just be a good person. Love other people, serve other people. And everything else, all the noise outside of that, like that will sort itself out. But really all we need to focus on is just being a good person. And that was what I focused on in my life in general. It was just, this is what I'm concerned about, this is what I want to focus on. Everything else is just background noise as far as I was concerned. And so yeah, I was able to stay out of, I didn't I wasn't attending Relief Society because I was in primary. um, More often than not, I was spending Sunday school either teaching a lesson because a teacher was away, or we had a couple of classes that had some really wonderful but challenging children with some challenging behaviors. So I would quite often be supporting in a lesson, or I was just kind of hanging around in the corridors waiting for someone to pop their head round and go, can you help me with this? Or can you take this child somewhere? Or can you come and sit in here for a minute? Or whatever it was. Um, so I didn't really go to Sunday school or anything like that. I wasn't part of any of those conversations where they're, really delving into doctrine and scripture, um, and I loved that. I was very aware that I was missing out on all of that, and I was very happy to do so. Um, and yeah, more importantly, I really loved the children that I served. We had some really wonderful kids in that primary, and it was a genuine pleasure to be there with them every Sunday. Um,
I can only imagine. I can only imagine. You've so you're there, you're in yours, but you're all in. You're teaching primary, you're teaching those kids. What happened?
so I get pregnant, which is obviously super exciting, um, but also caused a lot of anxiety, um, especially when I found out that I was having a girl. I had real fears about raising her in the gospel. Partly, partly feeling the pressure that it was all on me. Dad doesn't go to church. Dad's not going to be teaching her about the gospel. Dad's not going to be enforcing gospel principles or setting that example for her. And therefore, it's all on me. I have to teach her the gospel. I have to make sure she sticks to the straight and narrow. I have to make sure that she doesn't go off the rails and does all the things. I have to make sure she has a testimony. And I remember that feeling really heavy. Um, but then, secondary to that, there's also the fear of what I went through and how I was made to feel as a teenage girl, and being terrified that she would go through something similar and not knowing how I could protect her from that. And so, up until this point, obviously, I've mentioned my dad's out of the church, and my dad is very vocal when he leaves. He was very vocal and very anti. Um, I think as the years have gone down, there's been healing. He's moved on from that part of his life, and the emotions are no longer the same or as strong as they used to be. But at the time, yeah, he was very vocal about his anger. Um, and he would try and talk to me about the Book of Abraham was a big thing for him. Um, and all I knew was that there was a problem with the Book of Abraham because I wouldn't allow him to tell me any more than that. So anytime he tried to speak to me about the church and about his issues, about why he left, I would shut him down. Didn't want to know. I'd spent a life being told that this is the true church of Christ, and as such, Satan wants to destroy this church. That is Satan's mission. And so there is a plethora of anti-Mormon material out there that is designed simply to tear away people's faith. And, I thought, well, if Joseph Smith made it all up and it's all a lie, then surely it's just as plausible that everything that these people have written about Joseph Smith is made up and a lie. And so I didn't want to know. Wasn't interested in even looking at it. And I find that really quite fascinating looking back on it, because outside of my life in the church, I pride myself on being a really good critical thinker. Um, I've had to use critical analysis a lot in my. I've worked in education most of my life as well. I'm a qualified teacher. I went to university. My teacher training was master's level qualifications, where you have to do critical analysis in order to pass. And my teachers always talked about my critical thinking and how good that was and how great I was at, seeing both sides of an argument and being able to debate different issues and look at things from both sides. And
What was your subject? What was your subject?
RE.
RE.
Yeah. So
What was
RE,
what was the degree?
My degree was in psychology and the study of religion, and then I
Yeah.
did a PGCE in secondary RE, and then I got a job teaching RE and history, almost on a 50-50 split, and
Yeah.
I loved it. So I didn't do history at degree level, but I did take it for A level. I'm a big history nerd, love history, and obviously, as you know, as part of my role as a teacher, as a history teacher, was teaching people how to look at sources from the past and to, analyze what biases could be here. Is this a credible source? When was it written? Was it written near the time? Is this written by someone else 30 years after the fact who's, retelling stories that have been passed down? Um, there's all sorts of things that you can consider when looking at historical information to determine how credible that source is. Is this reliable? Is this something that we can trust? And yet, at no point was I open to studying that information about my church and about my religion and applying those same techniques to determine whether or not this is credible, is it reliable. I just completely, thought stopping straight away. No, not interested. I don't want to know about that. And then obviously I get pregnant and these fears all surface around my daughter and raising my daughter in the church. And when she was about 4 months old, I finally got to a point where I was I was ready to look at the information. And I will say at this point, I don't think I was actively hoping that the church would be false. I don't think I went into it thinking, I really hope I can find something that will prove this wrong so that I don't have to raise my daughter in this church. But I was open to the idea that, well, maybe it's not true. And maybe there is something in what my dad's been talking about. Maybe there is some truth in that. And actually, for the sake of my daughter, if I'm going to raise her in this, I need to make sure that it really is true. And I can't do that if I'm not prepared to look at both sides of the argument. If I'm not prepared to even entertain the information coming from the other side. If I'm coming at it from a bias of, I've decided it's true, therefore I'm going to completely ignore anything that tells me contrary. Um, and so my dad's a talker. I'm a talker. I felt very much like if I went to him and asked him to tell me about these things, that I would probably end up getting like a 5 hour long lecture with all sorts of details that I didn't necessarily need to know. And I also felt that he would, he was biased in terms of, I know that he wasn't happy I went back to church. Um, because in his mind it was all a crock of bull, and he didn't want me, you know, going through all of that for something that was just that was based on a lie. Um, but I also didn't want him to influence my decision or the conclusions that I came to. And so I ultimately decided that I would not talk to my dad, but that I would go to a good friend of his, um, someone who was actually involved in the whole debacle with the con man and was a very key player in that. He and my dad had gone through their faith journeys together, so it was quite a sort of parallel journey, and they ended up leaving the church at a very similar time. And so I reached out to him and said something along the lines of, I think I'm ready to look at the things that you and Dad know, um, but it's something that I really want to study for myself. I want to draw my own conclusions. Um, can you point me in the direction of anything, a website, a video, a book, whatever? Can you give me some sort of direction? Where do I go? Where can I find this stuff? Where can I do my research? And he sent me a documentary all about the Book of Abraham. And uh, for anyone who doesn't know, um, Joseph Smith claimed that he translated the Book of Abraham from an ancient Egyptian papyrus. Um, Obviously, this was before the Rosetta Stone. Nobody had translated hieroglyphics at this point. Nobody knew what it meant. He said that he could translate it. God was going to help him translate it. He translates the text. And from that, we have the Book of Abraham, which is like an extra little book of scripture, quite a small book of scripture. And that papyrus is still in existence today. It exists in a museum. It has obviously been translated because we now have the Rosetta Stone. We now have that knowledge available to us. And it has nothing to do with Abraham. It's a standard funerary text. It's got nothing to do with what Joseph has written in the Book of Abraham. It's a complete and utter fraud. And, going back to this idea of I'm a historian, I'm looking at the credibility of this story and, the experts that they had on this documentary that were sharing their insights. And it's pretty concrete, damning evidence, and it can't really be denied. And I think it was about 2 hours long, this documentary. And as it's going on, my jaw's just dropping further and further and further. And the penny is dropping that Joseph Smith's a con man. The Book of Abraham is a fraud. He lied. This is not what the papyrus said. He didn't translate the text. And if he's done that, then why on earth would I believe that he translated the Book of Mormon and that was a real text? It called into question his integrity. It showed to me that he was quite happy to lie. And by the end of this documentary, I just thought it's all based on a lie. Everything that I have believed in, everything that I've based my life on, for anyone who's not a Mormon, being a Mormon is not showing up to church on a Sunday and then going home and forgetting about it until the next Sunday. Being a Mormon, it directs every decision that you make in your life about everything. Everything comes back to the church, and what does the church teach, and what does the church tell me I should do? And I remember at the time feeling relieved because it meant I didn't have to raise my child in the church. I didn't have to put my daughter through what I went through. I didn't have to try and figure out how I was going to protect her from that. The way I was going to protect her from that was I wasn't going to raise her in it. I was able to just remove her completely from it. So there was huge relief about that. But there's also anger, that it's like the foundation of your life has just been ripped out from underneath you, and everything that you thought was true isn't. Your entire reality completely shifts in a moment, and I liken it to those pictures that you can get that just look like there's just like lots of colors and things on it, but if you sort of go cross-eyed and you pull away from it,
It really is. You used to have one on the wall at university. You have to stand it for ages, and all of a sudden, this 3D picture.
yeah.
And you understand.
This is it. And that's what it felt like. It felt like I had spent my whole life looking at that collection of colors, thinking that it's a 2D picture, thinking that I can see everything about that picture. I know everything about this picture. And then realizing that everything I thought was there isn't there, and it's something else completely different. And trying to figure out, well, where do I go from here? What do I do now? And in many ways, I think I was lucky because I'd had that period of inactivity. I'd had my 5 years out of the church. And so it was quite easy for me to just slip back into that quite naturally. And I didn't deconstruct. I did, and I should have. I will say that I should have, and I have deconstructed in the years since. But at the time, I had a 5-month-old baby. I have a physical disability, which made the early years of my children's life really, really difficult on me. I deal with chronic pain and chronic fatigue. Um, and so I threw myself into motherhood and concentrating on that. I was lucky that my husband wasn't a member. I didn't have to deal with the issue of me losing my testimony, but him still having his, and potentially dealing with the conflict that might come from that. I was just able to slot quite nicely back into the life that I'd had before. The majority of my social circle were not members of the church. And so it felt really easy. And then 2020 happens. So I left in 2013. So for 7 years, I carry on like this. And I'm not really thinking about church. I'm not deconstructing. And I'm just trying to forget about it and leave it in the past. And then we go into lockdown. And a few weeks into lockdown, I get a message from a friend. And she asks me why I left the church. Now, for anyone who's not been on this side of it, they might not understand the significance of that. But the truth is that when you leave, people don't ask you. Members do not ask you why you left. They don't want to know. I think there's a worry that, whatever you say might potentially shake their testimony, or it's because they simply assume that you've left because you wanted to sin and you didn't want to live the principles of the gospel anymore. And that is very much an idea that has been inferred and taught from the pulpit multiple times. This idea that people leave the church because they just can't stick it. They can't do all the things that they're meant to do. They want to sin. They want to do things they're not supposed to. And I think a lot of people just accept that without question. And so they've got no interest in having a conversation around why you leave. And generally speaking, the only people that ask you that question are asking you either because they've left or they're thinking of leaving. And this particular friend was someone who I never in a million years would have thought they would leave the church. They were probably one of the last people that I would have ever considered would leave the church. And so we start talking, and I explain to her, I talk about the Book of Abraham and then some other things with Joseph Smith and polygamy, particularly around his marriages to younger girls, that I had learned about since watching that documentary. And she starts, she's bringing things up in the conversation that I had no idea about. And I realized she's going on a deep dive. She's learning all of the things. And initially I had no real interest in doing that. But the more she starts talking about things, the more I'm like, I feel like I need to know more about this, and this was such a huge part of my life, that actually I need to know a bit more. So I start watching some podcasts, predominantly Mormon stories. That is the big one out there. It's grown phenomenally since 2020. There's so many more podcasts out there now, but certainly at the time that was kind of like the holy grail, I guess, of ex-Mormon podcasts, and I was really moved by by people's individual stories, and the things that they'd gone through, and hearing people have experiences similar to mine, hearing people go through trauma really similar to the trauma that I experienced, and also hearing stories that were really different from mine, and stories that perhaps involved a lot of trauma, but for completely different reasons. And I found a lot of value in that. But one of the things that I noticed with a lot of these people that were going on the podcast is that they really were deconstructing, because they recognized that indoctrination runs deep, as I said earlier. It really does. And the church, even after you lose your faith and you leave, the church can still have that hold on you. That indoctrination is so deep in you that the church can still influence the way that you think and feel about certain things, because it's so embedded in your brain. And And I became consciously aware that there were still areas of my life where the church had influence over how I thought or felt about a certain thing. And that was when I realized I need to deconstruct. I need to understand fully how the church had a hold on me, what the church did to me. And I need to actively work on removing those barriers in my brain and undoing that indoctrination and doing it very intentionally. Because I do not want to be controlled by that organization. I do not want any part of my life to be controlled by that organization. And it's at this point that all the trauma starts coming to the forefront, and I receive a diagnosis of complex PTSD. So I want to be really clear that as much as I needed to do it, and I strongly recommend anybody who's gone through any kind of faith transition from a high demand organization like the Mormon Church, it's really important to deconstruct. At the same time, it's really, really hard. It's painful. It brings a lot of things to the surface. There was a lot of anger. There was a lot of tears. And it was genuinely one of the hardest things that I've ever done. And, I spent quite a long time on medication for depression, and was also very fortunate that because of my diagnosis, I qualified for long-term therapy on the NHS. So usually you only get like maybe 6 or 8 sessions if you're lucky. With the nature of trauma, they know that 6 or 8 sessions actually isn't going to do anything. If anything, it's probably going to make it worse, because you're going to open that can of worms. You're going to bring all that trauma out, but you're not actually going to have enough time to really deal with that and move past it. So it was really good to just take that time and talk things through. So I think that's a message that I really want to pass on, that, it's hard work, it's painful work, but it's necessary work. And it's really worth it when you come out the other side.
Is the church true? Does it matter? That's for individual people to decide.
Yeah.
But it is decision, but it's something that should be evaluated with an open, honest, and accurate lens. And I think deconstruction is more about understanding that open, honest, and accurate lens than anything else. It is a tough process, and unless you have experienced deconstruction, it's also very hard to really appreciate what that looks like. And I think that a lot of members of the church, without a frame of reference, cannot grasp what deconstruction really, really means without doing it. A couple of final questions for you, Sarah. If you were to meet 13-year-old Sarah now, as well as giving her a big hug, what would you tell her?
You have worth. For no reason other than you exist and you're a human being, and we all have worth.
Yeah.
And you're not broken. There's nothing wrong with you. And it gets better.
I will quote scripture here. Doctrine and Covenants 18, verse 10. For the worth of the souls is great in the eyes of the Lord. You will never the empty chair at the table. I don't think that those leaders and those people around you during those formative years in their life would have seen you as an empty chair at that table. But it doesn't change your lived experience.
No.
It doesn't change the fact that, unfortunately, you had trauma, and as we've discussed today, some serious trauma and instance in those young, formative teenage years of your life. And unfortunately, the leaders and the people around you who we would trust to scoop you up, wrap you up and protect you, were not equipped to be able to do that. And that is not a criticism of that. We're talking, every one of those leaders was probably doing the absolute damnedest best they could to be a good leader, to support their youth, to fulfill their calling, to be the bishop in the bishopric that they never asked to be in, to be the stake president that they got as call on Friday to be called on Sunday, without even time to prepare, let alone be trained properly how to do it. I'm not going to criticise our leaders. I am going to draw a question on the structures behind our leaders and how they are equipped to prepare and support people. And I've mentioned it, I think, twice already today. I would encourage people to look at 21st century saints. Put a link in the notes. 21st century saints in the UK have done a huge volume of work on safeguarding. The people over there are safeguarding specialists, and they have worked with the church to bring DBS checks, as the checks on basic safeguarding process, into the church in the UK. It's not enough. There needs to be more. They currently have a campaign running where they've published a safeguarding in the church in the UK document, which they are sharing with church leaders. And their invitation is for us to be able to work with them to sponsor sharing of their document with bishops, stake presidents, politicians, and people throughout the church in the UK and beyond, to talk about safeguarding and protecting our young people in the church. And if you're watching this, go and have a look. Jane and Sarah over at 21st Century, they know what they're talking about, and they can help the church if the church will let them. But we need to protect our young people. You were not protected, Sarah, is the problem. And like I said, it's not about Wayne at this point. It's about people who are doing the right things. But you've shared a story today of how your experiences have caused trauma in your life. And I want to thank you for being so open and honest and frank and raw with us today, because I guarantee there's somebody listening to this who either went through these experiences in their youth or potentially is going through them now. Everyone has worth in the sight of God. However we view God, whether we are faithful members of the church, whether we're not, everybody has faith, as worth in the eyes of God. And I don't think I've got much to add to that, really. Do you have any final thoughts or things that you would like to share before we finish today?
No, not that I can think of. Just echoing what you just said, that yeah, everybody has worth. We all have worth. Okay. We're all worthy of love. We're all worthy of kindness. Yeah. And nobody needs to feel like the empty seat at the table.
Yeah. If you are still watching this recording, we're 3 hours, 18 minutes, 3 hours, 90 minutes exactly in according to my time. It will probably be a few minutes shorter than this by the time I've edited out every time I said and those kind of things there. But we're talking, but if you're still with us, thank you and bravo. At the bottom of the screen, just down here somewhere, you're going to find a button that says like. Can you please press it? You can find one next to it that says subscribe. please subscribe. And if you have found the conversation we've had today useful, thought-provoking, or supportive in some way, please share and let people hear the stories that are here. Sarah, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
It's been an absolute pleasure. And I think we'll wrap up there. So thank you very much for joining us today, Sarah. My name is Beyond Belief, and we will see you on a future episode.